As you no doubt pieced together from my incredibly thorough and extensive retrospective/review of Resident Evil Village if you watched it, when I finished the game, I felt pretty fractured as a Resident Evil player. As such, when New Capcom announced that a new DLC pack would be released for Resident Evil Village, which included an improperly playtested and insulting third-person mode, new additions to that mind-numbingly boring and repetitive extra content known as Mercenaries, and the main star of the pack, the Shadows of Rose DLC, my expectations were very low, and justified as well, especially with how New Capcom underdelivered with Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, and made such careless errors when designing Resident Evil Village with its story, characters, and gameplay. And it didn't help that development of the DLC only began after Resident Evil Village was released, so the vision of a DLC for Resident Evil Village wasn't even there when the game was initially conceived. The Shadows of Rose DLC not receiving much attention during the Resident Evil Showcase event was also concerning. Unfortunately, such low expectations were confirmed when I played through the Shadows of Rose DLC, giving it a score of 1.5 out of 10. I didn't even touch the Mercenaries mode, and what little I played of the third-person mode for the main game only caused me to never want to touch it again, as not only was it poorly put together, but it detracted from what I go to an Ethan Winters Resident Evil game for. This is something I'll elaborate on when I talk about the Shadows of Rose DLC, which is the DLC that this retrospective will focus on entirely. But hey, even though I gave the Shadows of Rose DLC a 1.5 out of 10, at least it's a better score compared to that pre-alpha of a Resident Evil game called Resident Evil 4 Remilk, but that's for another retrospective. Right now, just like what I did with Resident Evil Village, I will guide you through the mishaps involved with the Shadows of Rose DLC as we discuss characters, screenplay, gameplay, and especially the story, as this aspect is the worst part of the DLC by far, to ask the questions of why this DLC didn't try to be something better, and how this DLC is a terrible ending to the Winters family story arc. Having said all that, let us get into this, and obviously, spoilers. When we start the DLC, we open up to a park in an unknown city. Rose, now 16 years old, meets Hound Wolf Squad member Canine, as he had asked her to meet with him to discuss removing Rose's abilities. Spoiler alert, that's not actually Canine, that's an illusion generated by Miranda, but this needs to be elaborated on further later on in this retrospective, as this illusory aspect makes absolutely no sense. A couple of details are revealed during this interaction. First, Chris is still fighting against BOWs despite it being 16 years after Resident Evil Village. He was around 48 years old in the main game, so he's 64 years old in the DLC, just past retirement age. The Resident Evil podcast team mentioned that he's likely not operating in the field and is assuming a similar role to O'Brien from Resident Evil Revelations, where he's probably an advisor to Rose and the Hound Wolf Squad. I don't think he was advising Rose at the start of the DLC, since she says that she didn't really want to be a part of Chris's operations. Also, it's unclear if the BSAA is still operating or if Chris and his Hound Wolf Squad members are a part of a different organization. This is one of the main points of contention I had with this DLC. Setting this DLC 16 years after Resident Evil Village invalidates the story point of having the BSAA being evil during the events of Resident Evil Village. It only goes to show how this whole plot point of having the BSAA being evil was just shoehorned in for no reason, serving absolutely no purpose. It's like in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where they made Cassandra related to Aya from Assassin's Creed Origins. It served absolutely no purpose, they had no reason to provide this link, and it violated so much of the Assassin's Creed lore. Of course, in the BSAA's case, it's more so about how pointless a choice it was to make them evil, rather than about major lore violations. But the idea of setting a DLC 16 years after Resident Evil Village by itself doesn't make any sense. A time jump like that should warrant its own game, not a DLC that only lasts for about an hour if you're playing it right. Also, the idea of Rose removing her abilities being the prime focus of the DLC is another example of invalidation. They spend so much time in Resident Evil Village building up Rose's abilities, but then to say that the DLC focuses on removing Rose's abilities undermines the setup of set abilities from the main game. Why would you set up Rose's abilities if you're then going to do away with them in the DLC? That's a very amateurish setup for a story. It feels like in order to implement this idea of a DLC, they had to scrap a lot of the plot elements they set up in the main game. It speaks to aspects that lie in the same domain as a lacking confidence and a lacking vision with a story. It's like they're trying to rush the Winterseas' family story arc to a fiery death so that they can move on to other characters and other games. There are red flags already apparent during this introduction to the DLC, just like the introduction of Resident Evil Village when they introduced Chris Redfield in the manner that they chose. Fake Canine shifts the topic to Rose. He talks about school and about a group of bullies harassing her. These mean girls are harassing Rose because of how she's an easy target in the sense that she keeps to herself and she doesn't try to speak to other students. This is because of not only the spontaneous manifestations of her infection outside of her control, but also because of events that shaped Rose into being withdrawn when in public settings. To elaborate further and tie into other tangents worth discussing, these acts of bullying have been occurring for a long time, since elementary school. In a file that you get later on in the DLC, Rose first started going to school on January 5th in an unspecified year. I don't know if Mia got Chris to enroll Rose into school or if Chris actually made the decision himself, but regardless, Rose was excited and nervous to be in school. Between January 5th and January 8th, Rose was not having any success with talking to anyone, as no one would talk to her or they would be mean to her. Her hands would sweat out mold when she would panic. On February 10th, the condescending and belittling attitude Rose was receiving from her peers also extended to one of her teachers, as this teacher chastised Rose for always carrying around a hanky and coming across as a baby because of this. Okay, I know that teachers like these exist in our world, and you can find numerous news reports about teachers acting far below the baseline of unprofessionalism or just crossing many lines in terms of disciplining. But seriously, this is still baffling that there could be as shit a teacher as whomever this person was. The white mold seeping out of Rose was starting to be noticed by a lot of people, leading to insults being thrown at Rose. On April 4th, a girl named Lucy and her friend Catherine lured Rose into a bullying trap by pretending to be Rose's friends. I'm sure you can imagine how that ended up. And just like that, this cycle of bullying kept on continuing all the way to high school, I believe. And it didn't help that Rose's own knowledge of Miranda, the Megamycete, and her dad's death further contributed to her own sense of feeling like an outcast, which made her an easier target for bullying. At least such experiences haven't overshadowed her joking personality at certain points, but either way, Rose feels like a freak in many people's eyes. This is how the events are laid out, but there is one thing that doesn't make sense. Why was Rose even enrolled into public school? Did the developers forget that criminal organizations like the Connections were after the Winters family? Or were they dealt with in the few years after Resident Evil Village, before Rose was enrolled in elementary school? I highly doubt that an organization like that could be wiped out so easily. I mean, Sherry Birkin was within the custody of the United States government from 1998 to 2009 because of Albert Wesker being alive and because of her G-virus infection still being studied. As soon as Wesker was killed on March 7th, 2009, Sherry was able to leave the custody of the United States government. But this doesn't seem to be the same case with Rose. It makes no sense why they wouldn't take necessary precautions with Rose, the same way they did with Sherry. And the fact that Rose was having trouble with the spontaneous manifestations of her infection should also be a reason to not enroll her in public school. I get that Chris mentions that the white mold emerging from her is not infectious, but how is he so sure? How could this particular Megamycete emerging from Rose not be infectious? And even if it's not infectious, it's bound to cause a lot of controversy among her peers and school personnel. I mean, the world in Resident Evil is so accustomed to bioterrorism, as was indicated in Resident Evil 7 and in Village with the Baker incident report, that something like spontaneous manifestations of an unusual substance from an individual would profile as dangerous in a layman's eyes. And imagine Imagine if Sherry Birkin was enrolled in school so soon after the Raccoon City incident without properly checking her G-Virus infection. That would be problematic and would likely lead to a potential outbreak of the G-Virus. I can see this organization, assuming it is not the BSAA, is still just as stupid as the BSAA from Resident Evil Village with their handling of victims of outbreaks or potential carriers of infections. In fact, having mentioned Sherry, I think an interesting idea for this DLC would be for Rose and Sherry to meet together. I mean, they're both carriers of infections, and they lost a parent to an outbreak. Sherry lost both of her parents to the T-Virus and G-Virus in Raccoon City, and Rose lost her dad to the Megamycete. Do you have any idea how cool that would have been as a story device? What do you bet that Sherry would have related to Rose on her feelings of being an outcast and helped her overcome this grievance? This would have been a really clever idea. Surely, if they considered including Ada in Resident Evil Village, then including Sherry would have to be at the forefront of thought when designing the Shadows of Rose DLC. Even fake Canine asks the question of whether Rose had any friends to talk to regarding her condition, and Rose brushes off the idea because of how ludicrous it sounded, but it wouldn't have been ludicrous if Sherry was included. I get that she would be an adult in the DLC, but that wouldn't change anything. And I know that would negate a lot of the gameplay from Shadows of Rose and possibly distract Rose from connecting with her dad, but I still feel like it would be possible to work both characters in a meaningful way. Then again, in a file in Resident Evil 6, it does mention that Leon and Chris rarely came into contact with one another due to working for different organizations. So maybe in that sense, it wouldn't be possible for Rose to speak with Sherry. Still though, it feels like a missed opportunity, but it doesn't surprise me, because new Capcom has no sense of imagination, which is ironic because this DLC has so many uninspired ideas and just borrows ideas from the main game and other media. More on this point later. Fake Canine tries to reassure Rose that she is not a freak after she calls herself as such, but Rose still stands by that nomenclature and sarcastically remarks that at least she doesn't murder her friends, which I do not understand the context of because this just seems so out of the blue for just a joking remark. It felt more like a subtle jab towards Chris and how he shot fake Mia in the face at the start of Resident Evil Village, or maybe it was a jab towards Chris and the Hound Wolf Squad, taking down the BSAA members when they were storming the village near the end of the game. I don't know, it just felt like the writer had a slip and just integrated this line to break the fourth wall in my opinion. But moving past that, fake Canine then tells Rose that there may be a way to remove Rose's abilities, to which Rose agrees to seek out this method in order to be normal. Transitioning to one of the Hound Wolf Squad's labs, fake Canine acknowledges that Rose already knows about Miranda and the Megamycete and how she had researched it obsessively while experimenting on human subjects, and then adds that they found more of Miranda's research and found mention of a purifying crystal that is capable of removing the Megamycete from its host, which is such a stupid concept! Just the name Purifying Crystal gives off fantasy vibes, a vibe that does not belong in a science fiction-based game like Resident Evil. This is not crystal therapy. Why would they settle upon this MacGuffin to push the plot of the DLC? Need I remind you that they already have a more diegetic cure established in Resident Evil, that being the cure for the E-type Megamycete infection in Resident Evil 7? The cure in Resident Evil 7's End of Zoe DLC was not a MacGuffin. It was manufactured weeks after the Not a Hero DLC. They used the Connections reports as well as their own analyses of the E-type Megamycete to make the cure. And it's a good thing they didn't need a huge population of infected individuals to contribute to the development of the cure. They managed to manufacture a cure when only Mia, Zoe, Jack, Marguerite, and Lucas were infected at the time. I don't even know if I should count Ethan, as no one except for Mia was aware he was infected, even though logically, the BSAA/Blue Umbrella should have still done tests on him, but they didn't for some stupid reason. But you're telling me that even though it is 16 years after Resident Evil Village, this organization that likely succeeded the BSAA/Blue Umbrella after they were likely taken down in the 16 years after Resident Evil Village due to their corruption, couldn't find a cure for the village Megamycete that Rose was likely infected by? And it's still not clear if Rose was born with the E-type Megamycete or if Miranda infected her with the village Megamycete, though I'd lead more on the latter side of the case. But that shouldn't matter because the E-type Megamycete is 99.95% similar to the village Megamycete. Manufacturing an actual cure shouldn't be difficult. Is it possible that maybe because Rose was infected and reconstituted within the Megamycete regulator at only 6 months of age, using the cure on her would likely kill her because her cells would mostly be made up of Megamycete? I don't think so, because nothing really happened to Zoe when she was injected with the cure at a point where the E-type Megamycete progressed greatly through her body thanks to Eveline triggering biocrystallization within her to incapacitate her. It really doesn't make any sense, guys. And remember how I brought up the question of whether the developers actually played through Resident Evil 7 in my Resident Evil Village review? I'm bringing up that same question again, because if they did play through Resident Evil 7, then they would actually have the foresight to recognize that they set up a more diegetic cure rather than this nonsensical, fantastical, purifying crystal. But of course, we can't even trust fake Canine's words. Maybe all of this is not true and it's merely Miranda trying to gaslight Rose into believing that the Purifying Crystal is real to give her a reason to enter the Megamycete. But the DLC doesn't play it off as such, because when Rose does find the Purifying Crystal, which is not even the real thing since it's a replica created within the realm of consciousness, yet Rose treats it like it's real, it seems to actually work on her. But this contradicts the hallucinations, and this shouldn't affect Rose's body in the real world. This very poor writing decision, where the characters forget that they are in a fungal network, where the rules of the real world don't apply and it's like another dimension in a layman's mind, is so stupid. I'll bring up those moments when they do occur, but to sum it all up, the Purifying Crystal is a MacGuffin that has no place in the Resident Evil game. They already set up a cure for the E-type Megamycete in Resident Evil 7 that should theoretically work on the Village Megamycete given the 99.95% similarity between them. This new organization should have been able to manufacture a cure for the Village Megamycete easily. Rose being reconstituted in the Megamycete and infected by the Village Megamycete at a young age likely has no relevance to why a cure wouldn't work on Rose, because the developers never bothered mentioning if it had importance thanks to the very vague storytelling model that they favor for Resident Evil Village. And the Purifying Crystal shouldn't work anyway because it's a replica built within what is essentially on par with that of a dream world taking place within a fungal network. Also, the MacGuffin aspect of the Purifying Crystal is only given more validation when Rose destroys the Purifying Crystal at the end. It's practically Occam's razor. They could have written this DLC without the Purifying Crystal. I'm gonna lose my mind trying to piece together this terrible misrepresentation of the lore regarding the Megamycete and the world of Resident Evil. Fake Canine acknowledges that Miranda's notes are incomplete, and that the only possible way they're going to find the rest of her notes is by having Rose enter the consciousness of the Megamycete sample that was obtained during Resident Evil Village. Okay, you have to wonder if the BSAA is still around after seeing this, because they were the only ones going after the Megamycete in Resident Evil Village. How on earth did they extract a sample of the Megamycete when Ethan destroyed it at the end of the game? When could they have possibly obtained a sample? And how does Chris deem this acceptable to have this sample here? If this lab is known to Rose and the Hound Wolf Squad, then Chris must know about this lab. After fighting BOW since 1998 and having an immense hatred towards them and towards the people who make them, he would be incensed if he knew this sample was around. And I find it odd how Rose never says anything like, "Does Chris know about this?" or "Chris would kill you if he found out this existed," or "Why do you guys have a Megamycete sample?" She just casually goes along with what's happening. Once again, poor writing and poor character portrayals of Rose and Chris at their finest. And Chris is not even in the DLC. And you want to know something else? Having the Megamycete return is yet another insult to Ethan Winters. Do you remember how pissed off Star Wars fans were when Palpatine returned in Episode 9? And how this return ruined and dismissed Darth Vader's heroic sacrifice in Episode 6? It is the same case here. Bringing the Megamycete back undermines and disgraces Ethan Winters' heartbreaking sacrifice at the end of the game. It removes any sense of value in what he did and renders it null and void. Did this idea not cross their minds when designing this? It feels like a completely different writer handled this DLC. The main experience of Resident Evil Village was all about Ethan Winters' personal journey, although it could have been handled much better than how it was. But then this DLC comes along and already goes against this vision in the first couple of minutes of starting it, and they give no explanation for how this Megamycete sample is here. How much more are they going to disrespect Ethan Winters? This is so hypocritical in every possible way. Fake Canine gives a brief summary of what the Megamycete sample is. He says it absorbs and stores the memories of people who pass away in close proximity. This includes Miranda and everything she knows. If Rose enters the consciousness of the Megamycete, she can solve the mystery of the Purifying crystal. Rose is the only one who can enter it because of her deep connection to the Megamycete. Fake Canine tells her to think of it like walking through someone else's memories. There are a couple of things to note about these statements. What does Fake Canine mean when he uses the term close proximity? Close proximity would imply that people don't necessarily have to come into contact with the Megamycete to be absorbed into it, which doesn't make sense. That's a very strange choice in wording. Next thing to note, what Fake Canine said about Miranda's memories being stored in the Megamycete makes sense, because we know that Miranda combined herself with the Megamycete after Ethan dealt the final blow to her. The figure section of the extras menu also confirms this. What doesn't make sense is that the DLC doesn't play it off like Rose will literally rewatch Miranda's memories or walk through them when she enters the Megamycete, and Fake Canine literally says that the experience will be like walking through someone else's memories. If Fake Canine is a hallucination Miranda is controlling, and we treat him like he's a speaker for Miranda, why would she use this word choice if the gameplay doesn't follow this schema? Instead, the DLC treats the gameplay like it's a treasure hunt, and we're literally avoiding or dealing with threats to get this Purifying crystal that shouldn't even do anything because, again, it's a reconstruction within a manufactured world. And we go through sadistic games that are overseen by the Masked Duke and Eveline. These sadistic games and characters have nothing to do with Miranda's actual memories or the idea of memories overall. And these games take place within Castle Dimitrescu and House Beneviento, locations that have nothing to do with Miranda's memories. I don't understand how these kinds of blunders in writing could occur. How hard is it to look only a few pages back to see how the scripts for the writing and screenplay were set up? Anyone can do this. I wrote 166 pages for my Resident Evil Village review and was able to look a few pages back to see if I made any errors in my script. And my review was close to 7 hours compared to this DLC that doesn't even last that long on the first playthrough. I was able to piece all these blunders with the writing and the screenplay with the Shadows of Rose DLC on my first playthrough. I swear to God, guys, the intro for this DLC has more problems than the intro for Resident Evil Village, and it's over the span of a few minutes. It doesn't make any sense for a human being to write so poorly like this. I understand that development of this DLC started only after Resident Evil Village had released, but I don't see how that's relevant to writing skills. But moving on to the next point, when Fake Canine talked about Rose's deep connection, it made me wonder why Rose wasn't considered to be a high-value target in the BSAA's mind. If the BSAA had eyes on Miranda, even though this didn't seem to be the case based on the Baker incident report, then they surely would have known about Rose's supposed capabilities and tried to capture her if they failed to get the Megamycete. But I guess there was no need for that. They didn't know about Rose. Rose and Mia went into hiding after Chris and his men went to BSAA Europe HQ, or the BSAA is gone. But when Fake Canine tells her about her deep connection, she acted like this was common knowledge among personnel. So would it be wrong to voice this question on why the BSAA didn't think to capture Rose sometime after the events in Village? I guess that's up for interpretation. After hearing Fake Canine's statements, Rose then asks how to do this, to which Fake Canine replies that he doesn't know and that she should just try to reach out to it since the Megamycete/Megamycete behaves like a hive mind, as I've already pointed out in my Resident Evil Village review. Rose decides to give it a shot and reaches out to the Megamycete. During my blind playthrough, I was very annoyed that Rose didn't ask about her dad at all during this conversation. I mean, she's wearing his jacket. She's aware of how much he's dealt with the Megamycete. She's aware of what Miranda put her dad through. How does nothing in this lab make her think to ask the question of what happened to her dad? It doesn't make sense. Reaching out to the Megamycete, Rose finally connects. It then transitions to the realm of consciousness, where we see Rose free-falling through water. I have no idea why they would use this kind of iconography from The Evil Within or Stranger Things. The idea of falling through water or standing on it was meant to tie into the feeling of being within the liquid that's contained within the sensory deprivation tanks. My guess is the liquid that Sebastian Castellanos and Elle were immersed in was high in salt content so as to numb the senses and allow the consciousness to be better immersed into the mindscape they were entering, which is why the water iconography was used. Using that iconography here doesn't make sense. It's the first example of this DLC borrowing an idea from another media and integrating it in a way that doesn't make any sense. As Rose is falling, she starts seeing and hearing the memories of her bullying, which causes her to try to speak up loudly to try to block out those experiences. I know exactly what she's going through because the same thing happens to me. To better describe this, we carry these kinds of bad experiences within us, and it's hard to forget them, as it's all related to the reward center of the brain. The brain tends to hold on to these bad memories as a way to inform how one approaches later experiences. It's not something that we can control. It's what relates to the whole idea of trauma or more minor experiences. In my case, certain bad memories, whether they be visual or auditory, tend to come up in my head out of nowhere. This mainly happens when I'm alone. If I'm preoccupied with something like a conversation, my mind is focused on that rather than the bad experiences. When those bad experiences spontaneously show up, I tend to speak out loud, the first thing that comes to my head, to block out those experiences, as speaking out loud is stronger than just simply thinking about something else. There's a part of me that wonders if I'm intentionally trying to hold on to them due to my obsession with truth and how much I cannot stand when people gaslight the experience, try to justify themselves as right, say things in passing that come across as provocative, or do other things apropos to that. Maybe it relates to something else with me, but for the most part, I have no control over what bad memories I choose to forget. It has everything to do with how the mind is at the time of the event and how you handle it afterwards. But regardless, to get back on track, Rose has clearly been unable to forget these experiences, albeit it isn't so bad that it interferes with her daily routine or professional life. If it did, she would probably be taking the first steps towards mental illness. But clearly, connecting with the Megamycete has made her body pull up the bad experiences, as those are the kinds of experiences the body tends to prioritize automatically. In some of these memories, you can hear things like, Rose is so weird. She sees things that aren't there. She's a freak. Imagine wanting to be friends with her, and something just moved on her hand. Rose was apparently seeing things that weren't there at a young age. I don't understand how this is possible and was never known by Chris and his team. She doesn't even point it out in the journal that you get in Beneviento's area. And it doesn't make sense for Miranda to manipulate her at such a young age because during those years, she was trying to create Rose copies, or she was getting acclimated to the realm of consciousness. She didn't know how to manipulate Rose, even though manipulating Rose shouldn't be possible anyway. This quote makes no sense. Also, alongside seeing and hearing the memories of her bullying, for some reason, she can also hear the Duke and Heisenberg reciting quotes they said from the main game. This is so random. Why these specific individuals that she's never heard of in the past? This freefall segment is clearly focused around her past experiences. She shouldn't be hearing these two individuals. I don't get it. Eventually, after enough time has passed, and Rose speaks louder than before to quell the memories, she wakes up back in the lab. Only this time, she's in the first stratum of the actual realm of consciousness. This lab connects directly to the castle area and its dungeons, so we'll be able to make our way there. I think this is as good a time as any to lay out some major shortcomings with this DLC. Do not expect to find anything interesting in terms of environmental details, as the environments you go to in this DLC are all reused from the main game. There's no play on the surreal nature to this realm of consciousness by scrambling environments together to create jumbled environments, thereby making exploration feel fresh, rather than just retrekking through areas you've already gone through, and there are no new locations that might correspond to Miranda's memories. This would have been the perfect time to build upon Miranda's character, as her character wasn't built upon enough in the main game. She did not get the same treatment as Eveline or Jack Baker in terms of build-up, which is why this DLC should have used that to build her up, but they didn't. And the gameplay for this entire DLC is so underwhelming, just like Resident Evil 1 Remilk. We'll only be encountering enemies in this castle area, and they're all completely pointless to engage with aside from one enemy. It's just mindless running the DLC. How am I supposed to take the threat seriously at that point? And don't expect any varied enemy types, as there's only one enemy type you are encountering in this entire DLC: the Face Eaters. So much for the Megamycete absorbing the genetic data of many individuals over hundreds of years. And remember how the Megamycete was spontaneously generating lichens and Morieka during Chris's section of the main game for no justifiable reason? Clearly, the Megamycete logged those BOWs, yet nothing like them ever shows up in this DLC. It's about as diverse as Resident Evil 1 Remilk's lacking enemy diversity, as there is only one enemy type as well. I'm sure people want to say that there are more enemy types in Resident Evil 1 Remilk, like zombies, dogs, hunters, chimeras, and bees, but I fail to see how they're enemy types when you're just running past them all the time. At that point, they're not enemy types, they're just movable obstacles. They're only classed as enemies if you're actually fighting them, but you're not. And why would the bees count? They're popcorn obstacles, not enemies. Jesus, people have no idea what constitutes enemy designs. And going back to the Face Eaters in this DLC, with how much you're running past them, the same question is asked again. Can you even call them enemy types? They're just hurdles that you jump over easily, like you're in the Olympics, just like Resident Evil 1 Remilk. Lacking environments, lacking character build-up, confusing plot points, throwaway gameplay. God, this is so shallow. But again, Resident Evil 4 Remilk is worse than this DLC for more egregious, appalling reasons, and all these points about Resident Evil 4 Remilk will be laid out in a separate review. Let's return to what's happening in the DLC at this point. We find a file in the lab that talks about the idea of preserving the consciousness of individuals within the Megamycete, and also the idea of connecting to the Megamycete. Miranda's research confirms that the Megamycete preserves the memories of people who passed away within its area of influence by absorbing them into its own vast consciousness. Area of influence is as confusing a word choice as what fake Canine said about close proximity. The first page also notes other things that I've already talked about in my Resident Evil Village review. The second page says that subjects with a strong affinity to the Mutamycete can connect to the Megamycete, which is why Rose can connect to it, though you have to wonder why, despite having a strong affinity to the Mutamycete, she struggled with her abilities for 16 years. Now that I think about it, the phrase strong affinity to the Mutamycete shouldn't really exist, since affinity wasn't exactly a thing with the E-type Mutamycete back in Resident Evil 7. I'm sure a lot of less informed individuals may think that the molded in Resident Evil 7 are the result of subjects not having a strong affinity for the E-type Mutamycete, but the concept art says that individuals are immersed in Mutamycete when they're trapped in bathtubs for a couple of days. My theory is this: individuals immersed in too much mold and end up dead become molded. Jack, Marguerite, Lucas, and Zoe were never immersed in E-type Mutamycete. They were only exposed to Eveline, and they gained their abilities. Affinity didn't seem to be a thing. The only thing that was really different between them was their hayflick limits, what organisms they were exposed to, since Marguerite was probably exposed to bugs, and how much water they were exposed to, since in an unreleased file, water is meant to heighten the infection process of the E-type Mutamycete. Eveline could choose to speed up the infections to an unsustainable degree to flat out kill the infected individuals, as seen with Alan and that one worker on the SS Annabelle. Since Eveline wasn't a factor to consider in Lucas Baker's case, he was able to keep the benefits of the stage 1 infection without Eveline's interference. So again, is the term affinity justified with the Mutamycete? I think in terms of directly manipulating the Megamycete rather than using secondary abilities, that may be where affinity is applied, but this term seems to mainly apply with the Kadu, so I wonder if the developers are making the mistake of associating the term affinity with the Megamycete. The Resident Evil podcast team is of the same mindset as me, and they believe it's a typographical error or more of a generalization of the combined affinity created by the Mold and Kadu combo. It's then mentioned that this theory of connection should be verified using the Megamycete sample that was collected 16 years ago and connecting a suitable subject to it. Now, the use of the term "we" is confusing because this would imply that the BSAA is still around, as they were seemingly the only ones who were at the village 16 years ago. But I don't buy that for a second. The BSAA's rotten, corrupt nature should have caused them to dissolve. Surely, Chris and the other older Resident Evil characters exposed the BSAA's crimes, or was the BSAA overhauled again, yet it still has the name BSAA? For crying out loud, the very name Umbrella was uncomfortable to hear for many people, as the name Umbrella is synonymous with the world's first BOW incident with Raccoon City. This is why Blue Umbrella had to create a file explaining what their new goals were and why they kept the name Umbrella during Operation Lurking Fear. Surely the same would be said for the BSAA at this point. And how did they get the sample of the Megamycete if Ethan blew it up? Is it able to resist even the biggest of explosions and regenerate? If so, then one has to wonder why Chris didn't pump the Megamycete with many rapid-acting mycelotoxic rounds, as these rounds were the most effective countermeasure against Megamycete BOWs and other fungal BOWs capable of regeneration. Eveline was defeated in Resident Evil 7 through being shot multiple times by Ethan with rapid-acting mycelotoxic rounds. This makes absolutely no sense. Once again, the vision they had with this DLC was a blur, and this confusion bled into the writing and story designs severely. The final page details that the fake BSAA's policies prevent anyone from contacting civilians infected with the Megamycete, which I do think is redundant to say, as Rose is the only one at this point in time infected with the Megamycete. The writer of this file is displeased with this policy, as it prevents them from confirming the theory of connecting with the Megamycete. Connecting with the Megamycete could allow the preservation and indexing of human consciousness, and even the reclaiming of great minds. I think the first point about preservation and indexing is an interesting idea, and I feel like the Megamycete is the only vector in the series that could have ramifications for potentially benefiting the human condition, as we've seen how, as a secondary effect while propagating itself throughout the body, it releases a telomerase-like enzyme that triggers abnormal activation of the ERK pathway that leads to regeneration. Lucas Baker was a great example of this with his regeneration, though the E-type Megamycete might have elevated his already present sociopathy. But the regeneration and the maintaining of mental faculties in terms of not being so zombie-like could be classed as positives, though I imagine greedy corporations would hate the idea of regeneration and would instead opt for treatments rather than cures to exploit the general population financially. The preservation of consciousness is an interesting idea, though I question by what means the writer of this file intends to interact with the consciousness already inside the Megamycete. Does he mean inserting the consciousnesses into new bodies in the real world? Or does he mean having an individual with a strong connection to the Megamycete connect to the Megamycete to interact with the consciousnesses already inside? That's where this gets confusing, and it also makes me wonder again if this is the BSAA or not, because the BSAA's intent with obtaining the Megamycete was to weaponize it, not use it for good. So based on this statement, you have to wonder if this guy works for the BSAA or not. Then with the part where he mentions the possibility of reclaiming great minds, it's completely meaningless and makes absolutely no sense, as these great minds would have to have been in the village area and died very close to the Megamycete or its roots to even be cataloged within the Megamycete. Did this guy even do research on whatever great minds likely dwelled within this village area? This is such a dumb statement from this guy who seems to be a scientist. You don't need to be a scientist to realize how ridiculous this statement is. And if this guy considers Heisenberg or Miranda to be great minds worth considering, that's just as ridiculous. Finally, after talking so much about the cutscenes and the file for this introduction, we get into the gameplay. Rose leaves the lab and finds a file that indicates the presence of another consciousness searching for the Purifying Crystal. Once again, the question of whether the Purifying Crystal is real or not is put into contention. Does the Purifying Crystal truly exist in the real world? It only seems to be a manifestation in the realm of consciousness, but it has existed all this time in this realm of consciousness in the 16 years since Resident Evil Village. Fake Canine's words imply that the Purifying Crystal exists in the real world, and that Rose needs to search through Miranda's memories to eventually find the location of the Purifying Crystal in the real world, but it's never played off like this in the DLC. The DLC treats the Purifying Crystal as real and effective within the actual realm of consciousness, and when Rose obtains it at the end, it seems to work, which again, doesn't make sense for a manifestation to affect someone in the real world. Did the writers even look over the script, or do they come from another dimension, where the laws of reality work differently in such a way that objects in the unconscious mind are real? God, this is terrible. And again, we're not walking through past memories as Fake Canine suggests, as the gameplay is more like exploring a new world created by the collective consciousness of individuals. I don't understand why it's so hard for the DLC to clarify this or progress from a logical baseline in beliefs and understandings through what the characters say. If Evil Within can properly clarify what exactly the world of STEM is, why can't this DLC? This is not good, guys. This is really not good. And it's ironic because in a journal entry, Rose says, "I really don't get how any of this works," which perfectly parallels and mirrors how the developers clearly don't understand how the Megamycete was established in Resident Evil 7. That is so funny thinking about it. As Rose is exploring the dungeon and finding traces of liquid void that looks pretty similar to Megamycete, she then asks the question of what this stuff is, which is so stupid. She knows about Miranda and the Megamycete. Why would she ask such a dumb question? I guess being raised by Chris Redfield, the dumbest character in Resident Evil Village, there's bound to be a transfer of stupidity onto Rose. After discovering a prisoner in a cell and getting a key, Rose is nearly pulled into the liquid void, but is saved by the prisoner, who is a clone of Rose. During my blind playthrough, I thought this was Eveline, given that Miranda had said in the main game that Rose is Eveline's true complete form, which reads like Rose is Eveline to me. I thought in the initial trailers that the DLC would clarify this point, or if not, then maybe they would establish this Rose clone as Ava, who is Miranda's daughter. But it turns out, this clone of Rose is just that, a clone of Rose. And she's not alone. There are other clones imprisoned in cells as well, which presented as nonsensical and silly to me at the time of my blind playthrough. Almost as ridiculous and confusing as that moment in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where Cassandra finds those clones of herself, and that entire moment was just there for the sake of cheap shock value, rather than for anything else story-wise. And it was really presenting as such with this DLC during my blind playthrough. I don't really understand how I am meant to feel any sense of uneasiness with how slapdash this scene was done. Progressing on, I also took the time to mock the third-person mode for this DLC, since I couldn't properly appreciate the grotesque imagery I was seeing as I was trying to find this handle for the Switch. That's not saying I had a huge problem with the perspective. I don't mind it at all for this DLC. For the main game, the third-person mode was badly designed and spat all over what the developers originally had in mind for Ethan. And the third-person mode felt like new Capcom just caved into the demands of whiny babies who beg for this mode because they feel like camera perspective is what determines whether a game is good or not. These are probably the same people that complained about the over-the-shoulder perspective in Resident Evil 4 or in Resident Evil 2 Remake. In the latter case, these whiny babies took things way too far and contacted the original Resident Evil 2 director, Hideki Kamiya, multiple times over this supposed travesty on camera perspective, even though Hideki Kamiya wasn't even involved with Resident Evil 2 Remake. God, people get fired up over the dumbest of things. And I should know, because I called out someone who complained about the first-person perspective for Resident Evil 7 and Village, and they responded just as you'd expect, being the dunderhead and fired-up 2-year-old they were. Fucking idiot. Rose returns with the switch handle and witnesses a face eater killing the clone she was with. In her panic, she activated her abilities and stunned the Face Eater, something you see all the time in other media, where characters spontaneously activate their abilities when under emotional duress. One has to wonder why they settled upon this, when emotional duress was hardly a factor to consider with mold-infected individuals utilizing their abilities. This doesn't make sense. With the liquid void growing and more Face Eaters coming, Rose quickly escapes, but is blocked by a dead end. The dead end is quickly removed by an external force, allowing Rose to escape out of the dungeon and enter the castle. Rose is then contacted by an unknown entity who goes by the name Michael. Michael tells Rose to leave, but she doesn't know how, which is odd considering that later on, Rose will say quotes that are only possible to say if she has an idea of how to get out. Once again, contradictory quotes. After being told again to get out while she still can, Rose refuses, saying that she needs to remove the Megamycete from her body. She then asks if he's a guardian angel, to which Michael agrees before giving her his name. He then tells her to continue on, and this begins the castle segment of the DLC. Rose makes it to the main hall and observes the Masked Duke eliminating a Rose clone. From the point of view of someone starting this DLC for the first time, you have to wonder what the whole purpose was with bringing back a character like him. And when you're so used to his financially motivated self from the main game, you also have to wonder what he stands to gain from orchestrating this insidious game. And he was hardly a character that seemed real in the first place. He was purely a gameplay mechanic given human form, and had some of the most absurd capabilities ever that don't allow him to be diegetic to the universe of Resident Evil. Yet this DLC goes out of its way to include him, as if he was absorbed into the Megamycete, which makes no sense. But that's actually not the reason for his existence. It's best to talk about this later on when we get to the final part of the DLC. The Masked Duke points out to the dying clone that if she had shown a little grit and escaped from him and the Face Eaters at this moment, the Purifying Crystal would have been hers, which again, doesn't make sense in the context of memories. Even Rose acts like the Purifying Crystal is real at this moment, which is ridiculous. In fact, you know one thing that makes no sense? How do the Rose clones have the same aversion to their abilities as the real Rose? Why else would they be trying to find the Purifying Crystal? Because they want to get rid of their abilities. How on earth is this possible? There's no possible way Miranda accessed the real Rose's life experiences and manipulated the Rose clones to have the same aversion. This doesn't make any sense. How did this not cross the developers' minds when designing how the Masked Duke's insidious game would play out? The screenplay needed to be changed. Rose comically stumbles through the doors, accidentally revealing herself to the Masked Duke. She closes the doors and just stands there for a bit, giving the Masked Duke time to call for other Face Eaters. Why does she not run immediately? Why would they do this for the screenplay? They're really trying to make Rose look even more stupid, aren't they? With the liquid void and the Face Eaters surrounding her, Rose makes it near Castle Dimitrescu's exit, only for the gate to shut. Michael then steps in and tells Rose to get a gun through the most absurd avenue possible. He has Rose touch his words, which ends up generating the Lemmy pistol for her. How about generating more high-powered weaponry like a rocket launcher? Or better yet, you might as well write Purifying Crystal, and boom! Rose has a Purifying Crystal that defies the idea of memories, and she can just believe it's real and strip herself of her abilities. Roll credits! I can't even begin to tell you how stupid the idea of touching words to generate objects is. And if this is possible, why would the DLC then lock a shotgun behind a bunch of bars that can only be lowered with a key? Yet again, another example of contradictory details that aren't even spaced that far from each other in terms of when these scenes appear. Rose gets to where the fake Purifying Crystal is, but it's blocked off, requiring 3 masks to unlock it. First it was reused environments, now the developers are reusing objectives. We searched for 4 masks in Castle Dimitrescu in the main game. Now we're doing the same thing again. You can't say that limited time encouraged the developers to reuse objectives. Designing objectives is not something influenced by time, it's influenced by how creative the mind is at designing it. Why would they reuse an objective rather than create something entirely new? I don't see what's so difficult. What half-assed work that is so uninspired and uninteresting? Rose enters the courtyard and finds the first mask. Rose must destroy the Sclerotia tied to the Megamycete in order to free the mask, but the only way to do that is to use her abilities. Rose reminds Michael that she came to the realm of consciousness to get rid of her abilities. I am amazed that after seeing all the horrors she's encountered so far, all the clones of herself, the Masked Duke, and Michael, she is still willing to go so far to remove her abilities. No amount of childhood trauma resulting from bullying or humiliation could possibly drive anyone to be that brave in the face of irrelevant horrors. Talk about dedication, though I don't know if I'd call it genuine or foolish. Rose eventually relents, but confesses that she doesn't know how to use her abilities. You mean to tell me in the 16 years after Resident Evil Village, despite being aware of her abilities, she doesn't try to better control them or seek help from whatever organization is handling the fight against bioterrorism now? If she did, maybe she wouldn't have had a lot of childhood trauma surrounding her abilities, though if Chris had any sense, he wouldn't have put Rose in a public school. What? They don't have some kind of learning facilities at whatever organization is handling the fight against bioterrorism now? How do you think Sherry Birkin received her education after Raccoon City? She couldn't go to public school or leave US custody because of Albert Wesker being alive. After 2009, she became an agent for the DSO. I don't see why Chris didn't consider this for Rose. At least Rose would have been among others who understood her, though I suppose, without being exposed to the cruelty of children, teenagers, and teachers in badly handled public schools, she would not have taken the first steps to better herself in the face of adversity, but that's beside the point. And also, Sherry bettered herself in the face of adversity without needing to be in a badly run school. All I'll say is if I had abilities and had no idea how to control them, I would seek to understand them and learn how to control them better, not let the problem run rampant. It's not like Rose had anything else going on during childhood. Of course, from another perspective, learning how to control her abilities at a young age would have mirrored what Eveline went through with the connections and just continue that cycle, which would not be what Chris would want. But that's only one perspective, and that just borders on overthinking. And if Sherry learned to live with the G-Virus within her, why can't Rose? Jeez, did anyone play through Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 6 when developing this DLC? Where is their attention these days? And what has Chris and this organization been doing all this time then? But maybe you could argue that if Rose properly understood what happened to her dad before the start of this DLC, and she linked the Megamycete to the death of her dad, that would explain the aversion to her abilities and why she didn't seek to master them. Learning to live with the Megamycete within her would be like disgracing her dad's memories, is what I'm saying. But she says later on that she doesn't know one thing about her dad, aside from knowing about his sacrifice. That might say a lot to you, but it takes more than knowing about an unknown parent's sacrifice to better connect with them, which is why I don't relate her dad's death to her aversion to her abilities. Her aversion is based purely on the trauma she endured in school and the humiliation she went through. Overall, the idea that Rose never tried to understand her abilities over the 16-year period doesn't make sense. If the Resident Evil 7 developers handled the writing of this DLC, they would have done so much more than Resident Evil Village's developers. Michael then directs Rose towards an amplifier, which will help Rose focus her abilities. I have no idea what the lore justification for this amplifier is. Does this amplifier exist in the real world? Is it only a manifestation in the realm of consciousness that only acts as a placebo to trick Rose into connecting deeply with her abilities? Or did Miranda make it when experimenting with the Rose clones? I think it relates more with the latter case, and the text on the side of the Rose Flasks could relate to Miranda's findings with the Rose clones, but I don't really see how having Rose connect with samples obtained from failed Rose clones would amplify her abilities and allow a deeper connection. As a matter of fact, how exactly are the Rose clones teenagers? The only time Rose was ever sampled into the Megamycete was when she was 6 months old, but somehow the Rose clones are immediately born as teenagers without having to go through an infancy period. How does this make sense? This is awfully convenient that the age of these clones matches the age of Rose when she entered the Megamycete. You don't see Eveline aging into a teenager, she's still a little girl. Why is it so different with these Rose clones? And once again, as I acknowledged in my Resident Evil Village review, Miranda's plan to put Ava's 10-year-old consciousness into a body that is not the same age makes no sense. But this wraps up the confusion provided by this courtyard scene. We then need to make our way to the amplifier, which is past some throwaway enemies and scripted encounters. You can't do anything creatively with strategies, the enemies don't offer much in terms of interesting gameplay mechanics. It's practically Resident Evil 1 remilk design again. This DLC is single-mindedly designed for speedrunning. It practically cements my disappointment with games and content designed for speedrunning. Games and content designed for speedrunning never try to go out of their way to fleshen out mechanics or gameplay scenarios, as any added depth would conflict with the core designs of speedrunning. It really is a true reality. Speaking of mechanics, the whole idea of avoiding the liquid void is such a bare-bones concept. In the promotional gameplay for the Shadows of Rose DLC, the developers acknowledge that the world would practically be your enemy, which is meant to relate to the liquid void. But all this mechanic gets boiled down to is just, the floor is lava, don't step on it. That's what they wanted to hype up in the promotional material? Seriously? Anyway, in the room where the amplifier is, there is a file. Someone wrote in a journal about the mechanisms for destabilizing the Megamycete network. It's nice that they're acknowledging lore from Resident Evil 7 with the idea of Quorem sensing and autoinducer molecules and creating this almost hive mind effect we see with the Megamycete, where affecting one individual unit can affect an entire colony, like you'd see with bioluminescence in certain bacteria. Disrupting the autoinducer molecules will send a signal to the rest of the adjoining Megamycete and liquid void that habitation in the area is not possible. I'm not sure who wrote this journal, and I'm not sure why they use the term disruptive force. Also, I was of the impression that the introduction of autoinducer molecules not only led to the hive mind effect, but also the withdrawal of the Megamycete from the area as another outcome. I never thought that preventing the autoinducer molecules from bonding with the receptors on the Megamycete would also lead to a withdrawal signal being produced. I find it odd that they would say it like this in the journal. That's not how the signals work in the real world, I believe. Don't take my word for this. Rose picks up the flask, focuses her connection with the flask, and manages to gain a new ability to break down the Sclerotia that focus the presence of Megamycete and liquid void in an area. In her journal, she says that when she connected with the flask, she seemed to unlock something within her, and that for the first time ever, she can do something with her abilities. But this only seems ironic to her, as the whole point of coming here was to remove her abilities, not connect with them. It's odd how she acts like learning her abilities here will actually allow her to use them in the real world. Once again, the developers seem to forget that everything happening in the DLC happens in the realm of consciousness, not the real world, and this bled into the character portrayals, making the characters seem dense about the nature of reality around them. And playing off this idea that Rose's abilities are somehow unlocking in the real world, what good are such abilities if there's no Megamycete to manipulate? Far as we can tell, the only sample of Megamycete left is that sample of the Megamycete, and Rose can't seem to do things similar to Eveline, where she was able to generate E-type Megamycete from herself by vomiting it in excess of her body mass, or generating it through voluntary spreading. I think in these cases, Eveline wasn't emitting fungi, she was controlling bacterial colonies infected by the E-series mold. As I stated before, in my Resident Evil Village review, my interpretation of the mold slash Megamycete slash Megamycete is that the actual mold is a fungus. The Megamycete is the result of the mold, infecting bacterial colonies, which leads to the creation of the black substance and the creation of the molded through immersing victims in mold for days to allow the infected bacterial colonies to overtake the victim, turning them into molded. And then the Megamycete is the result of the mold infecting a specific, unique species of parasites to create the super colony we see in Village. But regardless of the case, Rose doesn't seem to be able to do things similar to Eveline, and as Chris stated later on in a file, the mold slash Megamycete that Rose generates isn't infectious. If that's the case, then she shouldn't be able to infect bacterial colonies and control them. And I don't think she'd be able to manipulate other species of fungi that are not the Megamycete. Yeah, now this story point on Rose getting her abilities in the real world is turning back on itself. And it's so bizarre that after 16 years of not understanding her abilities, she starts getting knowledge through these MacGuffin flasks. Speaking of flasks, I didn't mention this in my Resident Evil Village review, but the flasks in the main game don't make any sense. The information on the side of the flasks don't pertain to Rose, but to Eveline. The flasks talk about rapid aging if injections are skipped for prolonged periods of time, and Rose's name is on the side of the flasks. The idea of rapid aging only pertains to Eveline. This was due to chromosomal defects within her, causing her to rapidly age 25 times faster. It's why she was a granny in Resident Evil 7 after a 3-year period. She also was not taking her treatments, so she was deteriorating. Rose doesn't have these issues. She naturally aged 16 years after Resident Evil Village. How could the developers be so clueless as to not even change the visual assets of an object in the game that clearly don't match the character portrayals and lore points present in the game? I don't understand. This is staring them right in the face, and it's under their noses. How do you miss this? And I can't help but wonder if they reuse these assets from an earlier version of Resident Evil 7 and just place them in Resident Evil Village in a slapdash manner. Because of this inconsistency, I can't really trust the information on the sides of the Rose flasks. And how can I when all of this is taking place in the realm of consciousness? We head back to the Courtyard, obtaining the bronze mask through destroying the Sclerotia using Rose's newfound ability. In my blind playthrough, I gave a summary of the problems I encountered so far up to this point that is worth hearing. Yeah, so far, guys, this DLC is pathetic. I had a feeling it was going to be shit. Like, that's just new Capcom tech right there, because, like, you know, they want to keep the gameplay simple because they want to appeal to all the dumb fans that don't know what interesting Resident Evil gameplay is. All the gameplay is just so bare bones and uninteresting. You're just relying upon exploits. The enemy types are just reused enemies. Like, they're just reused Moriekas, just with a different aesthetic to them. The whole storyline is just not really a story. Like, I'm not really, like, getting any sense of a story with this DLC at all. It's not tying together events from Resident Evil Village or the Epilogue. Nothing like that. It's just... It's a very isolated story, and like the Megamycete returning doesn't make any sense. All of this just feels like reused assets with the castle area. Like, it's just so uninspired and uninteresting. And I don't expect this from old Capcom. And like this is why I'm saying it's new Capcom, because new Capcom's gameplay format for all of their Resident Evil games nowadays is just stripped down to alpha level. Like, this feels more like an alpha than an actual game. Like, just the level of potential here with this DLC is just not realized at all. I don't even know how I feel about Rose as a character. I mean, it's cool that she has some dialogue and, you know, like, there's something there, but just the times when her stupidity really shows, like, when she's asking dumb questions like, what's this liquid stuff, when she should be well aware of it, and somehow she has no mastery of her abilities 16 years after Resident Evil Village. And yet, Ethan told Chris to watch over her, teach her to be strong, this and that. And Rose was seemingly not that much of a strong individual. She doesn't seem like a developed individual. It doesn't feel like she's independent. Like, she's taking help from others, this and that, and she's not learning how to master her abilities so that she's maintaining better control of it, so that she's not coming across as suspicious to her students, to her fellow students. Some of her dialogue is fine, other times it doesn't feel so good. You know, there are just times where I'm like, is this really the daughter of Ethan Winters? I don't know, like, Ethan Winters was like a majestic character. There was a lot of mystique with him. But Rose, I don't know. Like, I'll have to see how she develops at the end of this DLC. But, yeah, just to sum it all up once again, this DLC's trash so far. The story doesn't feel interesting. I mean, minus some MacGuffin moments that really shouldn't warrant any reaction on my part, but... the reaction it does deserve is just a reaction of, what the fuck? And then like the gameplay elements are so subpar, so 1980s, like not 1980s, like 1990s. Like this feels like a game from the 1990s. It feels like it's from that generation. And that is not the Resident Evil I'm expecting. And it just feels like they're taking the same route like what they did with the Daughters DLC for Resident Evil 7, where Zoe Baker doesn't have the ability to block, and her gameplay is limited. I can understand with the Daughters DLC because the Daughters DLC was more so a story DLC. But if they're going to be adding like gameplay elements to this Shadows of Rose DLC, at least make it interesting. Like so far, I'm just not really getting any sense of creativity with this DLC at all. And it just shows. It's just so empty and so uninspired, so uninteresting. And like I've even seen one person say this DLC is amazing. But how? And how does this feel like survival horror right now? This is such a laughable, goofy experience so far, where I'm just like lamenting the controls, I'm lamenting the subpar gameplay. I'm having to use exploits to my advantage to reset the enemies so that I can actually dispatch them and their health is retained. So I'm pretty much using the same tech from Resident Evil Village because exploits were so heavily apparent and so like forceful in Resident Evil Village's normal gameplay that it's just being transposed onto here. It just feels like new Capcom is giving up with trying to tell a compelling story right now. Like, I'm just not feeling it, guys. I'm really not feeling it. And so far, this DLC just feels like a 2 out of 10. There is so much in terms of negativity, and I never thought it would lean to this extrema right now, but it really is. Like, the whole introduction to this DLC, it just feels like a walking simulator. It's just one specific path you're supposed to go because you don't have any weapons. And of course, when you don't have any kind of weapon in a survival horror game / horror simulator game, it's always going to be structured where everything is just a fake playable experience. You're just going down one specific path, taking this one rigid route, and it feels more like a cutscene than actual gameplay. And now we get into the gameplay, and it still doesn't feel like a game. It still feels more like an interactive cutscene right now. I'm very disappointed right now. And I thought I'd be more bothered by the third-person perspective, but I just don't feel anything. Like, that's just my reaction to this DLC. I don't feel anything substantial with this DLC so far. And I doubt the rest of the DLC is going to be improved in any sort of way. Moving to the second floor, we find the next Rose Flask, which grants Rose the ability to slow down enemies and stun them. It also allows you to break out of grabs and avoid damage. But when are you ever going to be put into that kind of situation when there are hardly any enemies? They only show up in abundance in the castle area, and they're just as basic in design as Resident Evil 1 Remake's enemy types. The slowed enemies also aren't susceptible to critical hits or increased damage. This ability is also tailored to a new consumable, White Sage. If you play this DLC right, you can amass on so much White Sage that Miranda will not stand a chance. I guess I can give this DLC credit for rewarding skillful saving of consumables to speed up a well-designed boss fight like Miranda's. Still doesn't excuse a lack of context as to why these consumables exist. White Sage is real, but it looks nothing like this. And why did the developers choose these specific plants? If you examine these consumables, it says that a crystalline substance is fused to it. I'm guessing the crystalline substance is the white coloration, because what else could it possibly be? Is White Sage supposed to be a plant that can adapt in a favorable way in response to the Megamycete? Is it even worth looking into because it's all taking place in the realm of consciousness where the rules of reality are different? How can such a reaction between the White Sage and Rose even exist if we're talking about what is essentially a dream world built from the collective consciousness of individuals? I don't get it. Using this ability, we grab the monocular key and leave. We then come across the Masked Duke displaying all the dead Rose clones and do a puzzle. We get down into the dungeon area, which is initially a stealth sequence that involves removing Sclerotia to clear a path to the Silver Mask. If you get seen, you can just go back through the crawl space to reset the enemies. It's what you'll want to do to optimize your route through this area. Once you grab the Silver Mask, you'll now need to escape. Given the lack of care that was put into this DLC, and how much this DLC emphasizes using exploits and holes to bypass throwaway enemies like Resident Evil 1 Remake, what do you think I did for this sequence? Push you out of the way. And he still got me. Fucking bullshit. Look at that. What are these fucking developers? What are these fucking developers? Oh my god. New Capcom is not even trying to hide their stupidity at this point. At this point, I was feeling very insulted as a Resident Evil player, just wondering what I was playing at this point. It honestly started to not feel like a Resident Evil game, or even a game in general, with how unfinished everything was feeling. This was really feeling like the worst DLC ever conceived for the Resident Evil series, and it was feeling worse than the other DLCs that have been in other Resident Evil games because of how it seemed to be striving for something greater and was striving to progress the overall story of Resident Evil. When such an elevated vision is translated into a very poor execution, that's worse than a DLC simply acting as extra content or introducing stories that take place before or during the main story, rather than after. Great examples of these include Desperate Escape and Lost in Nightmares from Resident Evil 5 and the Little Miss DLC from Revelations 2. These DLCs had low-quality elements, but their visions weren't as grand as Shadows of Roses. That's why Shadows of Rose is a worser DLC than what has come before. And it's inexcusable, since the Not a Hero DLC and the End of Zoe DLC from Resident Evil 7 represented Resident Evil DLC at their best. These DLCs are just as long, if not shorter, than the Shadows of Rose DLC, but they pushed the story of Resident Evil 7 further. They added new areas, they added more diversity in the gameplay, they had real difficulty to them, the enemy types were given a lot of thought, and they cared about being great. I don't know when development of these DLCs started, but if they started development after Resident Evil 7 released, there is no excuse for the laziness displayed with the Shadows of Rose DLC. And don't say that you can't accomplish anything spectacular with just a few months or a year of development. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood was developed over the span of a few months, and it is one of the greatest Assassin's Creed games ever made. It hides its development time so well, you wouldn't even know that it was developed only over a few months. A brand new city to explore, so much time and effort put into the story and character writing, new mechanics, new gameplay concepts, multiplayer, etc. And that was back in the PS3 era. What excuse does new Capcom have? Absolutely nothing. And they want to say that this DLC is harder than the main game on Village of Shadows difficulty, yet Shadows of Rose only has hardcore difficulty and barely any enemy types? Have they got a screw loose? What kind of dumb statement is this? And why bother giving Rose a gun at this point with how little she deals with the enemies? This is so clinically confused, mindless, and sad. After doing yet another puzzle to get the triangular key, we use it to gain access to the shotgun. By the way, Rose can craft shotgun shells and pipe bombs without needing to purchase crafting recipes. It's so bizarre how Ethan Winters in Resident Evil Village and Leon in Resident Evil 4 Remake need to purchase crafting recipes to craft supplies, yet Rose doesn't need to. New Capcom logic yet again, without characters who go through military training end up being worse than how they were before receiving said training. We get to where the golden mask is, destroy all the Sclerotia while using exploits to keep despawning the enemies. Again, what's the justification for putting all of these enemies here? Why would anyone waste pistol ammo or explosives on these enemies? Waste time dealing with the focus reticle system from Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake, only it doesn't offer any benefits this time around for some reason. Or try to approach the section normally. Maybe despawning the enemies and doing this quickly is what the developers considered normal. Grabbing the golden mask, we're then caught by the brute and taken to yet another reused part of the dungeon. The masked Duke then taunts Rose through a TV, knowing that she's the real Rose, and that it would be unceremonious to snuff her out so quickly. Hearing these lines in my blind playthrough made me realize how absurd it was that the Duke in the main game knew more about Rose's capabilities than Chris Redfield and the BSAA, yet he's not exactly a character that feels diegetic to the universe of Resident Evil given his ridiculous capabilities that I already discussed in my Resident Evil Village review. Also, how does the Masked Duke know about the real Rose when in a file that you get from a side area, he says that he does not recall a single thing, not who he is, nor how he came to be? How does he suddenly remember out of the blue that he's supposed to know about Rose, or how the real Rose would express herself in the situation? You could probably say that Miranda told him what Rose would be like, but he takes such reverence in knowing that he's captured the real Rose and gets to toy with her. Such feelings would only be the case if he actually remembered that he's supposed to know everything about Rose's abilities. And when he's using such words like unceremonious and he's relating them to himself, it only further supports this inconsistency. In fact, how did the Duke even know about Rose's capabilities in the main game? Just the way he talked about her, it's like he was there during the pre-ceremony where Miranda crystallized Rose and separated her body parts, leading him to somehow sense her latent abilities. That doesn't make any sense. God, why can't these developers stop themselves when going out of control with designing characters with these eccentric personalities? They're just making themselves look even more stupid when they can't even look back at characters they've designed to see the inconsistencies and poor writing they put into these characters. And they want to say that the Duke is real in this universe. Are they really that dense? Unbelievable. Having addressed all this to Rose, he then forces her to play a game of choosing which Sclerotia are real or not, as if the developers needed another way to waste the player's time. If you've memorized the locations of these Sclerotia, which is quite easy to do, you can speed through it without having to wait for Michael to give instructions and be on your merry way. Still doesn't remove the tedious and uninspired designs at play here that only serve as placeholders for the developers because they had no idea how to make a more creative and engaging sequence. And Michael is terrible at relaying instructions. Rather than using arrows or more specific wording to indicate where the true Sclerotia are, he just sprawls vague writing all over the place to make you spin around in a circle. This was the case on the third Sclerotia. Piecing the information together and understanding where to start looking and which directions I had to turn to track his words was so stupid and awkward. This is a comically horrendous sequence devoid of any substance. Michael praises Rose for escaping. No thanks to you, Michael, even though Rose thanks him. Rose spouts out a cheesy one-liner about hoping for a pony as a cheap substitute for actual substance, and we trek through the reused dungeon again. And just to remind you guys, we have not heard anything about Ethan yet. So much for Resident Evil Village being about Ethan's personal journey, yet they can't even pay him respect in the first half of this DLC. So insulting. And I was also getting infuriated at seeing the same reused assets over and over and over again. They've reused these assets in Mercenaries, now they're reusing them here. And I was really losing the plot with this story, as I couldn't even tell what the story was, or if they were even trying to tell a story at this point. They might as well have just created an extra game mode, on par with the bland quality of the Ghost Survivors DLC for Resident Evil 2 Remilk. That way we can do the same mundane tasks, but with new character models. I was not getting any of what was happening in this DLC during this point in my blind playthrough. Before Rose is about to enter the main hall, she talks with Michael, who says it's almost time before the Purifying Crystal is in her hands. I'm amazed this didn't occur to me sooner, but how was Michael fooled by this fake Purifying Crystal? Notice how I used fake twice, because this is not only a manifestation built from the consciousness/memories of individuals, but it's also fake. Just saying that sounded really stupid, but this should have sounded just as stupid in the developers' ears when they started believing that the realm of consciousness was the real world, and that it somehow makes sense for a replica to somehow hold any weight on par with a real object. Surely, after so long being in the Megamycete, Michael should be able to sense the real replica of the Purifying Crystal and realize that the one that the Masked Duke had was the fake replica. If Rose could sense the real replica of the Purifying Crystal, why couldn't he? Once again, poor writing and stupidity on New Capcom's part. Rose agrees with Michael that it's almost time, and she can't wait to get rid of her abilities. She does say that it's weird to let them go after living with them for so long, which is another stupid quote. We've never seen her demonstrate her abilities in the real world, and we aren't introduced to the file that reveals the problem she was encountering in elementary school, so obviously it's going to translate as pants on the head stupid in its delivery. And even if we were introduced to the file before this point, we'd still treat it as if she'd never really used her abilities properly in the real world. And in terms of actual scenes, we never see a 16-year-old Rose exhibiting some of the same problems she had back in childhood, so it comes across in the same sort of way. Therefore, her comment doesn't make any sense, and it just makes her look stupid again. Just hear my reaction to this comment.
But I have to admit, I lived with them for so long. It's kind of...
What the fuck do you mean? we never see her demonstrate her abilities whatsoever, and now she's like, oh, it's weird to get rid of them. Like, I could understand this if she actually used her abilities once in the real world, but she clearly demonstrates that she has never really used them at all in the real world. And she's like, oh, it's just weird to depart without them. Yet, can you really say that if you've never used them in the real world before? What kind of a dumb comment is that? Feeling further insulted by what I was seeing, I declared Rose to be a bad character and was flabbergasted that this was the daughter of Ethan Winters. Of course, now, I can say that her stupidity is attributed to being raised by Idiot Redfield, and that his stupidity throughout Resident Evil Village rubbed off on her. Rose finally obtains the fake replica of the Purifying Crystal. I'll just let this moment from my blind playthrough speak for itself. Where the fuck did you come from?
You've more than earned this reward. Almost looks like the real thing, doesn't it?
Obviously it's not going to be the real thing. This is in the realm of consciousness. And weren't we originally supposed to be exploring Miranda's memories? Why the fuck are we going through this sadistic game to get some false version of the Purifying Crystal? That's not even the real version, it's a memory. Why would this have any impact on Rose and her ability to remove her powers / abilities?
What?
I can't believe she thought it would be that simple.
It's a replica, of course.
Everything here is a fucking replica. It's a fucking memory built from the consciousness of individuals.
I had to bait the trap with something.
No! No!
Wow. What a... Oh my god, we're back in this dungeon! It's still the same assets from Castle Dimitrescu!
Now comes
Oh no, this is the Stronghold area.
The perfect place for your demise. Let the show begin!
This boss fight against the Brute is a soulless fight. He reuses so many of Aureus' moves, and you're better off just circling him around this obstacle. Rinse and repeat till he goes down in the first phase. You have to make sure you stand near these doors because the DLC doesn't properly indicate that the area is going to be flooded with liquid void. In my blind playthrough, I got caught by the liquid void without any warning, and I was also clipping on the Brute as he was rising, forcing me to restart. Using a pipe bomb to get rid of the face eaters, we now start the second phase. For this part, the Brute does only one move where he charges at you. Then as soon as he gets close, he'll do a combo reused from Aureus. I have no idea how new Capcom expected the average player to be able to avoid this move. Whether you're backing away or running away normally, it is physically impossible to avoid this move since he initiates it so close to you. In order to avoid this move, you must set yourself up in such a way that there is space on the right-hand side. As soon as you see him get close, you run to the side, avoid the move, then try to shoot his leg while he's comboing. If you have any leftover charges for your slow ability, use it on him after shooting him during his combo to maximize your damage per second. If not, you can repeat the process. He doesn't have as much life in the second phase. On the next phase, kill the face eaters with another pipe bomb, then grab the Rose Flask to refill your charges and gain an extra charge. The only attack from the Brute you need to worry about is the move where he teleports, then reappears to slam you. Stand in this spot, then position yourself to run around him in a clockwise manner. Don't move too soon, as he can track your movement and hit you, which is dumb. But his back is open to damage, while he's recovering from the move. Aside from that move, everything else is free game thanks to your abilities. Keep stunning him, damaging his back, and the fight will be over. What an absolutely boring, soulless, empty boss. An empty boss built for empty gamers. That's what I called this guy in my blind playthrough. And it's clear that the Masked Duke is hollow if he thinks this fight is entertainment in his eyes. Just as hollow as the morons who think the Knives Out challenge or Resident Evil Village is such a grandiose idea challenge. Yeah, playing a game like it's 1% finished, relying on looping attacks and dragging out encounters, breaking the game down to such a rudimentary level, not respecting the pace of a game, just to fill your dick and call yourself amazing for doing something 0.00001% of individuals won't do. Did these people ever think that there's a reason for this low percentage? It's because of something called common sense. Why don't these people go sit naked in the snow if they think doing something that goes against common sense is a rite of passage towards manliness and looking appealing to the eyes of other idiots just for pointless views? That's who the Masked Duke reminds me of, but I digress. The Masked Duke tries to kill Rose by drowning her in liquid void and summoning other face eaters, but Michael tells Rose to jump into the abyss. The Abyss acts like a loading screen for a deeper stratum, I believe, if Evil Within 2 serves as a good reference for this. Since it's the realm of consciousness, anything's possible, I suppose. Rose wakes up in a deeper stratum of the realm of consciousness. This time, it's Beneviento's area. I don't know why this DLC uses stratums as a concept of levels. What real-world scenario is the idea of a stratum related to? Sleep? As in, low sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, something like that? Evil Within never used this kind of concept. Why does this DLC do so? It's not like the level of the stratum has any relevance to the story. Michael says that the deeper you go down in the stratums, the harder it is to escape, but from what context does he mean harder? Is he talking about the ruling minds at play in each stratum, so their greater affinity for the Megamycete will likely allow them to interrupt Rose's attempts at escape? What use is that if Rose doesn't even know how to escape? Far as I can tell, Rose only escaped the Megamycete by eliminating the consciousnesses holding the realm of consciousness together. I'm using the Executioner DLC from the Evil Within as reference, I don't know. The whole idea of stratums is such a throwaway concept. Rose is still adamant in pursuing the true replica of the Purifying Crystal, not wanting to be a freak, wanting friends, and wanting a normal life. Relenting to her stubborn nature, Michael agrees to help Rose continue searching for the Purifying Crystal. As Rose is trekking through the gravesite, she finds the same dolls she used to have back when she was 6 months old. Why are these manifesting right now? I don't understand. And Beneviento isn't even controlling the area. It's Eveline. How has she managed to access Rose's subconscious and manifest these dolls in her view? How can hallucinations even be a thing in the realm of consciousness? I could kinda understand this if the Rose is Eveline's true complete form quote from the main game had any application, but it clearly doesn't. And why would Eveline take control of Beneviento's area rather than create her own? What could possibly link the two together aside from their liking of dolls? It doesn't make sense. Rose enters the elevator, with Michael telling her that Eveline is blocking him. The lights go out just like in the main game, only we are immediately transported to the basement of Beneviento's house. The basement is modeled in a similar manner to Ethan's hallucination, which doesn't make sense. Hallucinations are very different to the idea of memories. Memories are based on real things. How could this possibly exist? There's no such thing as a hallucination within a hallucination, or in this case, a hallucination inside a world tied to a fungal network. And did the Megamycete construct this area from Ethan's consciousness or Beneviento's consciousness? It would make more sense for this to be constructed from Beneviento's consciousness, but not in the manner it's presented in the DLC. I don't get it. Rose examines the next fake replica of the Purifying Crystal. The lights go out, and she loses her weapons and abilities, which is a recycled scenario from the main game. Limited time and budget again, with being unable to design a more original sequence that resonates creativity. Laziest, half-assed Resident Evil DLC ever. Finding the scissors and retrieving the relief of a child from the doll, Rose is then taunted by Eveline, saying that she won't be able to find the purifying crystal by slicing open her friends. Once again, Eveline somehow accessed Rose's memories and subconscious through unspecified means, an ability never demonstrated in Resident Evil 7. And there's no way that she gained this knowledge through the Megamycete. I don't understand this omniscient nature to her all of a sudden. As a matter of fact, it didn't occur to me until now, how does Eveline know about Rose's existence and that she's the daughter of Ethan and Mia? The only thing I can think of is that Eveline found out about Miranda's research on Rose within the realm of consciousness, as she was interfering with Miranda in some way, as indicated later on. Other than that, I don't have any clue as to how she discovered Rose's existence in order to foster such a hatred for her. Eveline cuts the lights out again and creates different assets this time. Rose is now forced to play with dolls that are named after bullies from her childhood: Lucy, Catherine, and Jimmy. She has to make them act out scenes that are meant to make Rose the target of bullying and favor negative emotionality in order to gain access to the breaker box key. Whether these scenes actually occur like this in the real world is not clear. I can't help but feel like the scenes that we create are meant to be an homage to that really dumb movie called Carrie, which featured that character with supernatural abilities that she uses to kill her bullies because she's a spawn of the devil or whatever. Definitely quite nonsensical, lame, and unrelatable compared to Elle smashing Angela's face in with a roller skate in Stranger Things without needing any abilities, and it helped to convey certain character traits present with Elle during the start of Season 4. If these doll scenes are meant to be an homage, then that only contributes to the lack of originality already apparent throughout this DLC. And having mentioned homages, the next part of the sequence is more unoriginal. After getting the breaker box key, we now need a fuse, which is another reused objective from the main game. However, this time around, we need to get past a bunch of Doctor Who weeping angel dolls that resemble the doll of Mia. So many other games have done this idea. Does Resident Evil seriously need something like this? And I remember on my first playthrough how much of a trial and error sequence this entire part felt like, because the game doesn't indicate that there are multiple dolls after getting the fuse. One slip up and you are literally stuck in the narrow corridors because Rose is unable to crouch under their arms or do very specific choreographed animations to get around them. And if your back is to a doll, even when they're on camera, they can still grab you. The hitboxes on the dolls also extend a bit to the side, so you can be clipping on invisible collision at times. I genuinely don't understand how any of this elevates the DLC or gives it its own identity, and you need to have forward knowledge of the sequence by restarting it a couple of times. That is stupid for a first playthrough. In subsequent playthroughs, you can spend so much time running away and not having to partake in this stupid game of looking at them to freeze them, then running away. This only serves to make the dolls feel throwaway even more. They might as well not exist in this sequence. But I don't mind that it's like this. I'm not giving respect to this unoriginal idea. Once we get to the elevator, the sequence is done, which ends the first third of Eveline's area. The first third of this sequence is a massive letdown. The psychological horror designs in this part have no weight behind them and have no relevance. In the main game, the objects are tied back to Ethan, whether it be with the doll of Mia, the wedding ring, the music box, or the film projector. The baby enemy was the manifestation of Ethan's fears of Rose, losing her innocence and turning into a BOW, which makes sense with her abduction earlier in the game. Ethan saving Rose was the main driving force of the game, so the psychological horror aspects involved actually had weight behind them. In the DLC, the monkey doll has no relevance at this point, as Rose doesn't even remember it, and the dolls of the bullies do not accomplish much to connect you to Rose. Why would you use these kinds of characters that we barely know to connect the player to Rose? It doesn't work. And I'm sure someone will say that the main driving force of the DLC is Rose going out of her way to remove her abilities to not be a freak and get friends, but that just sounds corny and childish of a driving force. That's hardly a befitting driving force for a survival horror DLC. And the doll enemies don't make any sense. What do Doctor Who doll enemies that freeze when you look at them have to do with Rose? It's like the Silent Hill 3 problem that people noted, where a lot of the enemies were just around because the developers wanted to have enemies, not because of an underlying symbolism with their designs. The director of the game noted that with certain enemies like the numb bodies, they were only creatures. No psychological symbolism was initially conceived when designing these enemies. As such, this idea connects to the Doctor Who dolls of Mia not making any sense with their presence. It's definitely indicative of rushed designs and wanting to push something out with the limited time and budget they had. Definitely a major low point for Evelin's sequence. Once inside of the elevator, Eveline somehow shrinks Rose down to the size of a mouse, or she probably made the world larger, I don't know. Rose now needs to sneak past Beneviento's dolls, which Eveline now has control over for some reason. One has to wonder if Eveline wiped out Beneviento's consciousness, but was able to take control over her section of the Megamycete constructed from her memories. How did Beneviento even get her own stratum of the Megamycete? God, this is getting ludicrous and nonsensical at this point. The story's just going all over the place. But that being said, not focusing on the story aspects, I do like the whimsical nature to the second third of Eveline's sequence. It has charm, and the music gives me Nightmare Before Christmas vibes, even though I'd never really watched the film before. But that's what I would think of with this music. The music alone makes this section a bit more fun to replay occasionally. Also, as you're moving through the area, you can find dolls of Rose inside of these cages in a tormented posture. The other dolls will attack the cages when you drop them, allowing you to get past the other dolls. It presents as a better concept to relay to the player Rose's bullying back in her childhood, and it carries a darker undertone to it, compared to those insignificant dolls of the bullies from the first third of Eveline's area. The music only adds to this dark undertone, as it's meant to convey Eveline's sociopathy and pleasure in tormenting Rose in music form. It's all a game for Eveline, and she practically gets aroused by Rose's torment like any other bully in middle or high school, albeit to a much more extreme and inhuman degree. There is a skill to iconography and music choice when designing these kinds of sections, and I can definitely see that here and feel more connected to Rose and show concern. This section is certainly more interesting than the Sherry and Ada sections from Resident Evil 2 Remake. Those felt more like interactive cutscene moments than gameplay sections. I'm sure other people may get sick of this section, but not me, that's for sure. Avoiding the rest of the dolls, we finally get to the bedroom, where Rose is surrounded by many dolls. The dolls overwhelm her emotionally by saying that no one likes her because she's a freak. She has creepy powers just like her dad, and this is the first time Ethan is mentioned by a villain. We've gone through a lot of the DLC, and we're only now getting mention of Ethan. I do not understand this decision. It's so wrong to have his first mention come from a villain. It's like he wasn't worth mentioning or remembering in Rose and the good guys' minds. That being said, the mention of her dad further overwhelms her and fills her with more anxiety, making her more vulnerable to the vitriol delivered by the dolls. A fearful Rose then runs from the Mia doll before shutting the door and embracing it to slow the Mia doll somehow. As she's running away, she continues to be verbally assaulted by the rest of the dolls coming from the Liquid Void, who keep saying that Rose has no friends, she's disgusting, she should be nice to her friends, and that it's all because of her dad. Again, Eveline somehow knows a lot about Rose, like she's accessing her memories, which is confusing. Michael manages to break through and contact Rose, creating a way out for her. Rose states that she can't take much more of this, before questioning why the dolls were talking about her dad when she never even met him. Michael asks Rose if she resented her dad for not being there for her, to which she says that she doesn't know, and that she doesn't know the first thing about him, aside from knowing that he died protecting her. At this point in my blind playthrough, I was confused by her response since I thought this DLC took place after the epilogue from the main game. The DLC never makes it clear when it takes place in relation to the epilogue, so you look at many of the scenes as if they took place after the epilogue, which presents problems I will talk about later on. Rose wishes that she knew more about him, and that she often imagines what her life would have been like if he hadn't died.
Sometimes I try to imagine what my life would have been like if he hadn't died. Would he have taught me to ride a bike? Helped me with my homework? Read me a story every night?
Her heart's in the right place, But I don't know how I feel about the scenarios she listed. They're all scenarios that take place during childhood, a period of development she seems fixated on for some reason. I feel like at her age, the scenarios she lists should be around her current age range, and to offer my interpretation of what life would have been like if her dad had been around, I don't think it would have been the best. Even someone like Ethan would have been pushed around by how terribly set up society is, and such anger and anxiety would have affected his relationship with his daughter. I mean, look at our world today. Taxes are at an all-time high, housing prices have skyrocketed, so many crappy companies are around, politicians are continually shaping the country into something worse, the societal stress/anxieties are leading to strained family relationships, you constantly feel belittled by everyone around you if you even think about expressing yourself, bigotry, being forced into terrible lifestyles and professional lives by your parents, we overvalue education and money, continual financial problems, we wait around endlessly for jobs because of how screwed up the job market is, and this ultimately plays to the military's advantage as it puts the individual in a no-win scenario where they have to sign up for the military and get treated poorly. Scammers continually use the holes in society's established systems to play upon the desperation of individuals, to scam them out of money. Gun violence, the constant illusion of free will/choice. We're constantly questioning the love of our parents. We feel cynical towards the world. We're unable to understand the value of life. I mean, human beings are worse than any BOW, that's for sure. I can only imagine how terrible Rose's life would have been if she supposedly had a normal life with her parents. One has to wonder if Rose understands this, but she still pretends that it would have made a difference to ease herself. I feel like at her age, she should understand some of the things I've listed. Not all of them, as she hasn't gone into her college years yet, has been raised by Chris in the care of whatever unknown organization he works for, which is a very different situation to how the average individual is raised, and has not lived with both of her parents to truly understand the nature of society. To sum it all up, I don't think Rose's life would have been any different if Ethan survived. It's the unfortunate, self-destructive nature to society as a whole. And if you recall throughout the Resident Evil series, the world seemed to be temporarily affected by the advent of BOW incidents, but then as soon as the incidents were dealt with, the world went back to its screwed up nature. Even characters like Leon and Chris from Resident Evil Death Island acknowledge how screwed up the world is. Without the advent of evil, I don't think we'd learn to respect everything dear to us, and in our complacency, we create conflict with ourselves. It's in our nature to seek conflict, unfortunately. I'm sorry to say this, but that's how I feel about this potential scenario if Ethan survived. No matter how humble he might have been, no matter how legendary he was, Ethan would still have been brought down to the same level as any parent in society and approached his family and societal status with the same attitude as any other generic parent. And he would have died for nothing meaningful in the end if he lived the meaningless life of a 9-to-5 worker, dying only to serve a bitter and corrupt society. At least in the main game, he died saving the one thing that truly mattered to him as being precious: his family. With Rose, in a normal lifestyle, there would definitely be moments where she would question the love of her parents and feel disillusioned at certain points in her life. Still though, I do have to applaud her for believing that if her dad survived, she would have had a life worth living for. It's good to hear that. With all that said, Rose then wonders if her dad would have been there for her, proud of her, before telling Michael that when feeling lost or afraid, she tries to imagine what he might have said to her. Michael tells Rose that there is something that she should see, before bringing her to a safe haven modeled after Ethan's house in Romania. This is one of my favorite moments from the DLC, and it's the one time I can allow reused assets from the main game. As someone who fell in love with Ethan Winters as a character and as a real dad, it was heartwarming to explore his memories after his heartbreaking sacrifice at the end of the main game. And it was clever for the developers to pace the DLC in such a way that the placement of this moment would have impact. We just did a lot of dark, macabre sequences. It's near the end of the DLC. We need this kind of break. This is one of the main facets of survival horror design. It's what allows the player to open themselves up to feeling something for these kinds of positive sequences. It allows the player to not feel fatigued with the environments and scenarios at play. I think it's very intelligent of the developers to put this kind of safe haven moment here. Throughout this house, you can find various glowing objects that when interacted with, play a quote from Ethan that Rose can hear. Her curiosity, happiness, and intrigue with exploring her dad's memories allow her to briefly forget all the evil she has encountered thus far, which I really like. She also finds a note from Mia to Ethan, which makes her remember that she hasn't seen her mom in ages. I'm not entirely sure what the circumstances regarding Mia are if Rose hasn't seen her in ages. It sucks that Mia could not be in this DLC, but I guess they really wanted to focus on Ethan and Rose for this DLC, but it feels wrong to neglect a member of the Winters family like that, especially when this is the last time we'll see them. The developers probably couldn't get Katie O'Hagan back to voice Mia. That's the only thing I can think of. Rose finally goes to the study and finds a note from her dad describing something he made to cherish the memory of Rose's birth. Rose finds the key behind the picture of herself and opens the sideboard, revealing her dad's gift for her.
A letter for me?
Happy half-birthday, Rose. My gift to you is a promise. I'll always be there for you, no matter what. I'll be there every birthday to watch you blow out the candles on your cake. I'll be there to make you breakfast and walk you to school every day. I'll be there when you have a bad dream and sing to you until you fall back asleep. I'll hug you tight when you're troubled or worried and tell you that everything's gonna be all right. You are my precious Rose. Never forget that, Dad.
It's a bittersweet moment for Rose, as she is touched by the words of her dad, yet saddened that she will never get the chance to truly acknowledge the gift he gave her and embrace his presence as a dad. The only real gripe I have with the scene is the speed of Ethan's voice when he's reading the letter. I feel like there should have been slightly longer pauses between each of the sentences to complement the bittersweet tone of the scene, as well as a slightly slower speed to Ethan's voice to complement the sappy emotions he was feeling when he was reciting this letter. With the current version, the slightly fast speed almost comes across as rushing for the sake of completion, and it kind of messes with the player's investment into his letter, as it ends before such investment can be completed. It's almost like Todd Soley, the voice actor for Ethan and someone I admire, was having difficulties reciting the full letter and had to go through multiple takes, which led to him rushing a bit. I speak from experience, as I often mess up my own commentary multiple times before I get a proper recording, and you can kind of hear all of that in my final recording sometimes. Aside from that, I like this letter addressed to a 6-month-old Rose, and I can definitely see why Ethan would feel embarrassed if anyone else had stumbled on it. Rose is deeply moved and driven to tears, but such a precious moment is cruelly interrupted by Eveline, who infiltrates the safe haven and drags Rose back into her part of the realm of consciousness after falsely declaring to Rose that no one loves her. Back in Eveline's domain, she taunts Rose by saying that she never had the true replica of the Purifying crystal to begin with, and that Rose will have to go to a deeper stratum. Her hatred for Rose is delivered through more vitriol, saying that Rose can't trust anyone. She is foolish for believing Eveline had the Purifying crystal, no one loves her, and no one will care if she's dead. With Eveline's domain filling with liquid void, Rose must now escape. Eveline continually lashes out at Rose, saying that she was Mia's first child, yet she can't grasp why Mia wants Rose instead, who she deems as beyond worthless. Interesting that Eveline voices this even after Mia told Eveline in Resident Evil 7 that they will never be a family. I guess Eveline is still insecure and refuses to accept the truth, so she's twisted the facts to suit her own fantasies. Eveline then starts to project her own problems onto Rose, calling Rose greedy, and that even with so many friends, it's never enough for her. This is in reference to the number of molded she created in Resident Evil 7 as part of her family, yet they did nothing to assuage her years of loneliness. Cutting Rose off from the elevator, Eveline says to her that this was supposed to be her chance. Ethan and Mia were supposed to die and join her here in the Megamycete, which is a puzzling quote that I don't understand the context of. Eveline never knew about the village Megamycete before and during Resident Evil 7. She didn't pass away in close proximity to it, so there is no way she should even be here. How can she say that she intended for Ethan and Mia to die and be brought into the realm of consciousness when the events of Resident Evil 7 took place in Dalby, Louisiana, which is nowhere near Romania? The only thing I can think of is that based on the tragedy of Ethan Winter's concept art and the part where Eveline was described as creating a network of mold in the English version and creating a Megamycete in the Japanese version, the large accumulation of mold in Dalby would have created its own realm of consciousness for Eveline to rule over. Then, when Ethan and Mia died in Dalby, then they would join her. And maybe the Eveline we're dealing with thinks that she's part of the network in Dalby, not Romania. But this still doesn't make sense, because why keep them alive during the events of Resident Evil 7 then? Either that, or she's completely lost it with Rose at this point. This quote needed refinement. Michael then holds back Eveline to allow Rose to escape, with Eveline not understanding how he's penetrated her defenses to enter the drowning world at this moment. Rose is glad he's made it out, which is a strange way to phrase Michael's return, as he was simply pushed back by Eveline for the time being, right? I don't know. Michael then tells Rose that she needs to face Eveline and weaken her if they're going to escape her part of the realm of consciousness. This fight against Eveline is simple, with just waiting for Eveline to do triple wind blasts, then using your abilities on her, but I definitely find it more interesting than Beneviento's encounter. Like I said before in my Resident Evil Village retrospective, as is the case with many psychological horror-based sequences in the game, the lack of weaponry and options can only contribute to a simple sequence. Judgments towards the sequence have to be different, given that its foundations are steeped in psychological horror roots. I don't think this sequence needed to be more, because the other aspects such as the music and Eveline's voice acting resonate with me greatly. The music especially, as you truly feel the evil emanating from Eveline. It's that kind of evil that should define Resident Evil in terms of its villains. It's something that we've honestly never gotten with other villains in the series, in my opinion. Eveline, at this point, has completely lost it and has really gone out of her way to form such extreme fantasies in her head to complement her hatred of Rose and to remove any sense of accountability on her part for the poor hand she was dealt with for life. She says that she was a good girl and that it doesn't make sense for Ethan and Mia to be obsessed with Rose, someone whom she considers to be worthless and a freak without any friends. If she wasn't born, it would have been perfect for Eveline. She is still in denial, even after Resident Evil 7. I can still remember her haunting words when she said, "Why does everyone hate me?" If all this is meant to relate back to that quote, and she's still holding on to that ego and negative emotionality to still be stuck in place mentally after her death, then it's clever. Rose weakens Eveline enough to allow Michael to incapacitate Eveline temporarily. Like a child who throws a tantrum and by the end of it feels completely drained and helpless, Eveline breaks down crying, saying how useless she is and how it is no wonder no one loves her, as if she's temporarily accepting the reality without getting in her own way. Rose's words bring back Eveline's rage, and she tells Rose it's all her fault, which is the same thing she also said to Ethan in Resident Evil 7. In a last-ditch effort to prevent Rose from getting what she wants, she prepares to unleash a powerful attack, only for Michael to physically manifest and knock Rose out of Eveline's domain, telling her to not give up and find the true replica of the Purifying Crystal while he holds off Eveline. And this is the last time Eveline is shown in this DLC. Having said all that, let me just talk about Eveline overall in this DLC. Eveline's performance in this DLC is incredible, as we again see her dominating side and her experience in torturing victims to make them learn a sense of helplessness, while also seeing her own sense of helplessness after beating her. Paula Rhodes is such a great voice actress who's somehow able to make the cliched, demonic, supernatural girl model from many lesser rudimentary fan psychological horror games like Emily Wants to Play or cliched B-tier movies like The Shining and just brush aside casually like they're one note and repetitive, feel AAA in its quality. And the music that plays when you're escaping Eveline and fighting her has so much evil and tension built into it, it once again epitomizes what Resident Evil means. The Resident Evil series has a lot of standout tracks, but Resident Evil 7 and Village are the best when it comes to capturing that sense of evil with their villains. And the atmosphere they provide is unparalleled. It's so good that it makes it very hard to go back to the older Resident Evil games with their campy B-tier atmospheres, or the era of Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. Eveline is truly one of the greatest villains ever made in the entire Resident Evil series. Albert Wesker may be a strategic villain with a lot more screen time than Eveline and a massive hand over the entire BOW arms race, but Eveline truly represents evil. And I think that Eveline, being a child and not being affiliated with any government, organization, or evil corporation, adds more to this. She feels like the perfect representation of an evil born from an isolated residence, an evil that has festered underneath the superficial terrorist attacks and outbreaks, and underneath the hubris of the other Resident Evil characters. The developers should be really proud of what they've delivered with Eveline. I don't think we'll ever get a villain that is as impactful, as meaningful, or as developed as Eveline. It's just a shame that Eveline's presence within this DLC has no meaning in the end. Once we leave Eveline's area, we just forget about her, and she's only mentioned a couple of times afterwards. It makes me wonder why they even set up the "Rose is Eveline's true complete form" quote in the main game. If you were to remove Eveline from this DLC, nothing about the outcome at the end of the DLC would change. It already doesn't make sense for Eveline to be here, to know the things that she knows about Rose, or to talk about her plans for Ethan and Mia in the ways that she says them, but to make her existence negligible in the end only validates what I'm saying, unfortunately. Falling through the void, Rose awakens in the deepest stratum of the Megamycete, contemplating what happened to Michael. Piecing together Michael's voice with that of her dad's voice from the safe haven, Rose comes to realize that Michael is her dad and that because of him, she can continue to find the true replica of the Purifying crystal. How he was absorbed into the Megamycete is unclear, but I believe it has something to do with Miranda promising to sample him after she ripped out his heart. That's the only thing I can think of, yet logging his consciousness within the Megamycete through his heart or his blood doesn't make sense. It's confusing, but I'm still glad that he's here though. Rose proceeds to the main village area, spotting a couple of objects from the previous strata, which were dumped in this area for some reason. I'm not sure if this is a natural thing within the Megamycete, or if this is somehow related to Rose interfering with the controlling influences like the Masked Duke and Eveline, and the realm is just shaken a bit. It seems reminiscent to Evil Within 2, where after killing Stefano and Theodore and having Myra become the ruling power in place of Lily, Union greatly collapses, but this isn't so much of a collapse in this case. There are also these black orbs in the sky that continually rain what appears to be liquid void or mutamycete alongside other random objects. Not too sure if these are meant to be parallel to neurons, pre/post-synaptic neurons, or receptors. The DLC doesn't bother exploring the significance of this area or these orbs, so they're completely irrelevant. Rose also senses the true replica of the Purifying crystal coming from a large Sclerotia, which again makes you wonder why Michael was fooled by the fake replicas of the Purifying crystal if he's dwelled within the Megamycete for so long. Making her way down, she spots a clone of herself walking away and is startled by some crows. I think this is Miranda, given that you hear her laughing and how she leaves behind crow feathers when she teleports. But how on earth did she copy Rose down to her current clothing when Rose has only now entered the realm of consciousness? That doesn't make sense. A bunch of Face Eater Rose clones block her way, but using her enhanced abilities, she's able to get past them and make her way down to Miranda's lab, where she witnesses some kind of organic cloning device creating teenage Rose clones, which, as I've stated before, doesn't make sense, as Rose only came into contact with the Megamycete at 6 months old. It doesn't make sense for the Megamycete to do something on par with future age modeling software to create a teenage Rose clone. And even if that were the case, why a teenage Rose that happens to be the exact same age as the real Rose at this time? There's no sense to this. This entire room is just like Miranda's lab from the main game, where it serves as a massive lore dump before the finale, so there is a lot to note from this area. Expect me to go into a ton of detail right now. In one file, Miranda details her knowledge of the Megamycete. The Megamycete absorbs the memories of all life within close proximity, while maintaining certain laws that govern the realm of consciousness. For the first point, the memories that comprise this realm do not strictly reflect reality, which is such strange wording that makes it very confusing to understand the context of. Is this referring to how the environments are presented, how the physics are handled, or with how the events of a memory play out? It can't be the latter case, as we don't walk through memories as they're happening like in Evil Within. In Evil Within, there were moments where white visual echoes of past events that occurred within the real world, or STEM, would play out. In this DLC, we're simply exploring another world that's progressing in a similar flow to the real world, no different to traveling out into space and exploring another civilization. So what does this statement mean? I can't believe they thought this was acceptable wording when designing the English script. For the second point, only those who are attuned to the Megamycete in life retain control of their faculties here in this realm. When she says faculties, I believe this refers to clarity of thought, retaining memories, and not being mentally incompetent or degraded to the point of acting like a zombie. But how exactly does this kind of life attunement to the Megamycete allow them to retain these faculties? Is it like saying that the human cells are corrupted data, whereas the cells infected by the Megamycete are not corrupted data, so the Megamycete can properly translate them into something readable within the realm of consciousness? But how is this any different to what happened in Resident Evil 7 with Ethan talking to Jack and Zoe? I get that they were alive, but if they could retain their faculties in this fungal network sequence while they were incapacitated or unconscious, then why would attunement to the Megamycete matter? Also, relating back to an earlier point in this retrospective, the idea of attunement sounds similar to affinity, but the Megamycete has nothing to do with affinity. Only the Kadu has relevance. I know Miranda touched the Megamycete emanating from the Megamycete, and she seemed to be the only one to gain resistance to aging, mimicry, and other memories from past individuals, implying an affinity to the Megamycete. But we don't hear of any other individuals doing the same action as Miranda and getting the same benefits, or if there were any dire consequences, so we can't definitively say that the Megamycete has to do with affinity. Once again, the developers are getting the idea of affinity mixed up between their vectors. Also, if individuals have to be attuned to the Megamycete for life to retain their faculties, how did Ethan retain his faculties? He was only infected by the E-type Megamycete for 3 years. It doesn't matter that he died as the main game described, which already was a massive violation of the lore from Resident Evil 7, as it played out more like he was unconscious rather than dead. And I don't see how being dead for only a couple of minutes could possibly contribute to increased attunement to the E-type Megamycete. And what happened to the Lords as well? They were infected by the Kadu, which was infected by the Megamycete for decades, which would have to qualify as life attunement, right? Yet they don't show up at all in this DLC. And also, in Resident Evil 7, if infected individuals died in the real world, they would be cut off from the fungal network. That's why we don't see Marguerite during the conversation between Ethan and Jack, because she was dead before that moment. Jack and Zoe were there because they were alive, yet all of a sudden, it's now possible for dead individuals to manifest themselves inside the realm of consciousness by simply being attuned to the Megamycete for life, even though this presents many inconsistencies. For all I know, the Megamycete being composed entirely of infected parasites likely does something to allow individuals to be logged into the fungal network even after death. I'm just drawing blanks at this point. Continuing on with this note, Miranda acknowledges that she became aware of these laws through visions she had before her death. What does she mean by visions? Was the Megamycete demonstrating some level of sentience and generating visions within Miranda that it could control? Which is probably only the case because of how it's comprised of parasites, or are these visions supposed to be similar in presentation to the conversation between Ethan and Jack and just appear spontaneously whenever she was unconscious or sleeping? Was she seeing the realm of consciousness through the parasites, and that's what allowed her to understand the laws of the realm of consciousness? This is so odd. But just like Eveline, she is aware that she is dead. Her physical body was completely absorbed into the Megamycete, which is true as shown in the finale of the main game. Her memories, consciousness, understanding, and knowledge through her life were all transferred into the Megamycete, allowing them to serve as a source of power. Harnessing this power can allow her to affect the thoughts and memories of others. Now, this part is confusing. I don't understand the context for what a source of power means. That's such a strange choice of words again. Does she mean that this better understanding of the Megamycete allows her to feel like it's another kind of power mentally? Or is the Megamycete translating this into something physical in the realm of consciousness? Is this in reference to the giant Sclerotia we see before entering her lab? Is the almost hive mind process of the Megamycete using her memories, consciousness, understanding, and knowledge to make itself more powerful and translating all this into some new addition to the realm of consciousness? Or is this in reference to the creation of the Rose clones? Is that what she means by affecting the thoughts and memories of others? Literally turning them into Rose clones? If that's the case, then shouldn't she just say, with my prior understanding of the Megamycete and my new knowledge of the realm of consciousness, I can manipulate the realm to suit my needs and create new versions of Rose in the process? That would have made a bit more sense in terms of writing and more contemporary word choices, rather than whatever incoherent gibberish the developers decided to put there. I know she's voicing her own experiences, and people tend to be more intrinsic and poetic with their word choices, which is probably why she uses the phrase source of power to describe what her memories, consciousness, understanding, and knowledge end up feeling like, but this is all taking place in a game. In any kind of media, whether it be a movie or video game, such poetic, intrinsic writing still needs to be phrased in such a concrete way that provides more clarity, allowing the viewers to grasp the details and understand the story better. And it also helps the viewer understand if the developers understood what they set up for a story. All I get from reading this is more confusion from the developers that contributes to a jumbled up mess of a story. And they're trying to use such strange phrasing to confuse the viewer and give the illusion that they actually consider the story elements wisely. If I were to choose a perspective to comprehend Miranda's strange writing, I would say that this paragraph is in reference to not only the shaping of the realm of consciousness, but also the creation of the Rose clones. I think the creation of the Rose clones is an important distinction to recognize when comprehending what the phrase affect the thoughts and memories of others means. If we simply took this phrase literally, it wouldn't make sense for this capability to be tied solely to the Megamycete. Eveline exercised control over her victims through the Mycete and got them to do horrible things. I'm not sure if she deliberately overwrote the memories and thoughts of her victims, or she prevented them from self-reflecting or even taking the time to consider their prior memories when the Mycete infection progressed greatly. But I would lean more on the latter side. But regardless, simply taking the phrase affect the thoughts and memories of others literally presents with inconsistencies. I mean, when I first saw this line in my blind playthrough, I thought the developers had forgotten what the Mycete did. It felt like they were taking the capabilities of the Mycete and just transferring them to the Megamycete, then telling the viewers to forget what you know about the Mycete. The Megamycete is the only thing that has these capabilities. That's what this came across as in my blind playthrough, which is why I feel it's important to make this distinction about the Rose clones. Moving on to the final part of this file, Miranda says that there are many minds and memories gathered within the Megamycete, so finding her daughter Ava among the rabble is a challenge. Miranda notes that Ava's memories are dissolute and that finding a vessel to hold those memories may be important. The only vessel that has ever been perfect is Rose, which is why Miranda desires her. This is probably the most confusing point in this file. How can the idea of a vessel possibly apply to the realm of consciousness? weren't the Rose clones originally the visual accumulation of the memories and consciousness of victims absorbed by the Megamycete, and the only reason they look like Rose is because Miranda did something to overwrite their memories and consciousness to try to create a replica? Going off of this logic, the scenario that Miranda is describing is like inserting one person's memories into an accumulation of another person's memories. Do you have any idea how nonsensical that sounds? And remember what happened with those Rose clones back in the castle? They were being victimized by the Masked Duke and the Face Eaters to get them to unlock their abilities in their pursuit of the fake replica of the Purifying Crystal. So what would happen after they unlocked their abilities? Would Miranda then do some unspecified process to insert Ava's memories into the compatible Rose clone, and then that clone would change into Ava? That doesn't seem like it based on the screenplay we've seen throughout this entire DLC. And how would she even find Ava's memories if they're dissolute and lost in this jumble of minds and memories logged in the Megamycete? I don't understand. This is so badly conceived, and this entire section of the file feels like it's describing Miranda's plan in the real world, not the realm of consciousness. The idea of a vessel feels more applicable to the real world than to the realm of consciousness. And even if it is applicable to the realm of consciousness, how would inserting Ava's dissolute memories into a vessel possibly stabilize them and bring her back through the vessel? Wouldn't she just be a mess in terms of her memories? That's what I think. And why would it matter if the vessel had their powers or not? They're within the realm of consciousness. What threats could possibly loom within the realm of consciousness that could threaten the safety of Miranda or the vessel that's meant to house a 10-year-old's consciousness? Far as I can tell, all the threats within the realm of consciousness are all created by individuals heavily attuned to the Megamycete, from which there doesn't seem to be many individuals. And there's no way Miranda is trying to preserve the abilities within the vessel for world domination in the future, as how would she even leave the realm of consciousness? Why would she even care about what's happening in the real world when she can just settle with her daughter in the realm of consciousness if her experiment is a success? How can she possibly satisfy the goal of creating a vessel without devices like the Megamycete regulator? Wouldn't she need to crystallize the vessel and split it into 4 parts like she did in the main game with Rose? Like, the number of questions brought about by this file are too numerous to describe. It's all just contributing to confused storytelling. You just have to wonder if this story was even constructed by the AAA developer at this point. Of course, before that point, you have to wonder if there's a story at all. So much of this DLC just feels like a series of unfortunate events with its flow, rather than a coherent story. In another file, Miranda says that she was experimenting with manipulating and reviving consciousnesses stored within the Megamycete, which I assume relates back to the previous file on affecting the thoughts and memories of others to turn them into Rose clones. Again, how Miranda was able to get a teenage Rose's genetic data to even turn these victims into Rose is confusing. The victims of the Megamycete have their consciousnesses preserved within the Megamycete, but over time, they become diffused and diluted, spread thin throughout the Megamycete, and mixed with other consciousnesses and memories. It's because of this process that Miranda has had difficulty extracting and reassembling Ava. And relating this back to a previous point regarding strong attunement to the Megamycete, it doesn't exactly line up with what I suggested, where the Megamycete treats the Megamycete like it's readable data that can be encoded into something readable within the realm of consciousness. The process that Miranda describes seems generalizable to everyone, not just individuals who are not attuned to the Megamycete for life. I get that when people take on multiple identities, there's a psychological process that can lead to a collapse in their mental comprehension, so this DLC takes that concept and transcribes it into diffusion and dilution of the consciousness over time. But the idea of attunement doesn't seem like it would apply here. Also, when talking about the idea of mixing with other consciousnesses and memories, I am surprised Miranda's consciousness didn't go through something like that despite her strong attunement to the Megamycete. I mean, she touched the Megamycete emanating from the Megamycete in the main game, and this allowed her to obtain the memories of previous victims. With this in mind, you'd assume there'd be some kind of identity crisis leading to the possibility of diffusion and dilution of her consciousnesses, regardless of her attunement to the Megamycete. I guess the developers completely forgot about that point from the main game. But talking about this file further, Miranda had gone out of her way to combine individual consciousnesses into a single entity. She had respooled the threads, whatever the hell that means, and succeeded in creating the Masked Duke. She acknowledged that she recognized him from the real world, which I find contention with, because why would she allow an outsider like him to stop by the village from time to time? I get that he maintained trade relations with Alcina Dimitrescu and would often deliver old newspapers to villagers even though Miranda forbids them, which would imply that she tolerated his presence, but it seems odd that she didn't try to maintain more discretion when keeping the village a secret. I would have figured that as the ruler of the village, she would want to keep the village a secret so that she could surreptitiously experiment on the villagers. Then again, she did take in Oswald E. Spencer and also aided the connections. I'm definitely getting mixed signals here, unfortunately. I'm surprised I didn't point this out in my Resident Evil Village review. I guess she was fortunate that Spencer and the connections had the same hatred for humanity as her. But returning to this file, she noted that the Masked Duke had a deeply warped psyche and was missing a portion of his face. If you ask me, his personality wasn't that different from the main game. He only seemed calmer in the main game because he had no reason to express his more aggressive side. As a concluding comment, Miranda notes that manipulating memories in a person is possible, but the methodology she used to create the Masked Duke is not a good methodology. I question how exactly Miranda manipulated or measured consciousness. Consciousness doesn't have a physical form like blood, muscles, tissues, or spinal fluid. It's all electrical signals between neurons. What exactly is she manipulating physically within the realm of consciousness? How has the realm of consciousness given form to consciousness? And if none of the absorbed victims were actually alive within the Megamycete when they died in the real world, how did Miranda extract their consciousness and give them the form of teenage Rose? Could it be related to the organic birthing device that was generating those Rose clones? Maybe the consciousnesses of the victims were being fed to this device, and this is how the Rose clones were being made. It's all speculation in the end, unfortunately. In another file, Miranda says that she intended to duplicate Rose so that the perfect replica would be a suitable vessel. The results were not favorable, as some kind of interference was preventing Miranda from creating the perfect vessel. Instead, the Rose clones ended up being living dolls that had no power, yet somehow they're portrayed as having the same aversion to their abilities like the real Rose. And again, how did Miranda make teenage versions of Rose? Miranda comes up with several hypotheses for the interference. The first hypothesis is related to Rose being alive, but I don't see how that would interfere with the cloning process. That feels like a non sequitur in making a deduction. The second hypothesis talks about some other actor within this realm, which looks like a typo for factor rather than actor. The third hypothesis talks about the flaws with her methods of production. Ironically, I pointed out in my Resident Evil Village retrospective and earlier in this retrospective how all over the place Miranda's methodology was and how ludicrous everything sounded when talking about the idea of a vessel. It's already so unclear how Miranda was even experimenting with consciousnesses. Flaws in the methods of production. Gee, you think? It's from here that Miranda decided to lure the real Rose into the realm of consciousness. This is confusing because the first hypothesis was phrased as if Miranda believed initially that Rose was dead, then she's acting like Rose is alive. Or is she saying that there is a part of Rose's consciousness already inside the realm of consciousness interfering with her experiments? The latter doesn't make any sense. How did this slip past QA when going over the first drafts? They can't even be bothered to look over one page in a file. Miranda then notes that the Rose clones have some semblance of Rose's abilities when subjected to situations that evoke extreme terror, which is what led to the stress test that the Masked Duke was overseeing. She doesn't note the Rose clones' aversion to their own abilities, so again, how did the Rose clones somehow copy the real Rose's aversion to her abilities, causing them to seek out the replica of the Purifying crystal? It's definitely worth reiterating for the millionth times that you guys don't forget this question. After reading this file, Rose ponders whether Miranda was truly watching over her all this time, which is an odd question to ask because how would Miranda be able to establish a link to the real world? The last file in this room talks about Miranda being aware of Eveline. The wording in this file makes it unclear if it was written in the past or the present. Eveline apparently infiltrated the realm of consciousness at some point while she was experimenting with consciousnesses. There's no indication of how Eveline was logged into the Megamycete. Miranda just goes with it. The next part of the file is confusing, and it really seems like every file in this DLC is filled with confused writing. Had Eveline not interfered, Rose would have succumbed to despair and been dispossessed of her will to live and her abilities. Is Miranda talking about the real Rose? How could this be? Rose was not even in the realm of consciousness at this point, assuming that this file was written in the past. If she was referring to the clones, she would have said clones, but she doesn't say that here. Assuming this file was made around the time the real Rose entered the realm of consciousness, what did Eveline do to interfere? Rose only escaped the Masked Duke by jumping into the abyss. Eveline wasn't around while Rose was exploring the castle, and Rose only stumbled upon Eveline when she entered her stratum. If Eveline was able to occupy her own stratum, and she clearly stood out if she was the ruling power, why didn't Miranda try and take her down? Can these ruling figures even transition between stratums? If Rose can do so, why not them? Miranda then says a new passion burns within her and that she has to extinguish it. Who's the her in this case? Is it Rose or Eveline? If this file was written in the past, then I would assume the her is Eveline, and her new passion was to interfere with Miranda's plan, but this clearly wasn't the case. I'm just surprised Eveline doesn't acknowledge Miranda's existence to Rose during her segment. If this file was written in the present, then the her would be Rose, but what new passion could possibly burn within her? Rose's desires to remove her abilities have not changed due to Eveline's interference, so why is Miranda saying this? The writing of these files is so bad and poorly phrased. It's honestly the worst writing of files I have ever seen in the Resident Evil series. I don't even think Resident Evil 4 Remilk's files are this bad with their writing. I guess in the end it doesn't matter because the realm of consciousness doesn't work the same way as reality, so the files don't hold much weight in the end. But it's Miranda who's writing these files, so there's some weight involved with that, but with her terrible phrasing, one has to wonder if all of this was originally phrased in another language, then translated poorly to English. It really feels like that with her incomprehensible gibberish. I can't believe that AAA developers could be this flippant with a DLC's writing. It's absolutely appalling. They should be ashamed to call themselves professionals in the video game business. But let's finally move on after this massive exposition dump, if you can even call it that. Moving through the tunnels, we find a pointless note from a Rose clone saying that she felt the pull from the true replica of the Purifying crystal, but she couldn't go on because she wasn't brave, fast, or strong enough. I mean, you got all the way to the deepest stratum. How can you say you weren't brave, fast, or strong enough? And how did she even die? It's too funny thinking about it. What is the point of this file? In the cave where the Megamycete used to dwell in the real world, there's an altar that shows two demons around a baby, whom I believe is supposed to be Rose. Miranda offered a prayer to the Megamycete, which she calls the Black God. She basically described the Megamycete's cataloging of genetic data and the creation of the realm of consciousness, giving her love to the Megamycete. It's funny how she says the Megamycete was preserving all the life it absorbed, yet the consciousnesses of the victims were all diffused and diluted over time, making them all invalid as properly functioning consciousnesses. There weren't any life forms dwelling within the Megamycete. It wasn't until Miranda even thought of the means of reviving consciousnesses within the Megamycete and outside of it to contribute to the creation of a vessel for Ava that this idea of preservation came into fruition. She was the one who was fulfilling the preservation idea, so she really doesn't owe this much devotion to the Megamycete. With regards to her abilities bestowed through the genetic data cataloged in the Megamycete, her resistance to aging in the real world, and the cataloging of Ava's consciousness, I can understand her praising the Megamycete in those contexts, but not based on the context listed in this sermon. We finally make our way to the true replica of the Purifying crystal, where Rose holds it in her hand and begins to feel her abilities leaving her, making her more normal. Again, how a replica that is built from the memories and consciousnesses of individuals can affect Rose in the real world to strip her of her abilities makes absolutely no sense. It's not like it's a placebo to make Rose in the real world believe her connection to the Megamycete is gone, so she can therefore feel normal again, because it wouldn't exactly remove the activation of her abilities in response to extreme terror or anxiety. We don't even know if the Purifying Crystal even exists in the real world. If it doesn't exist in the real world, how can it be manufactured in the realm of consciousness and even have this capability to remove the Megamycete from its host? And since Rose was reconstituted from the Megamycete regulator, wouldn't a large amount of her body be entirely composed of Megamycete, so coming into contact with an object that can remove Megamycete would be a fatal experience? Or does she still have human DNA, making up a large percentage of herself? It doesn't make sense. In fact, at this point in my blind playthrough, I noted something odd. Why would Miranda even be looking into research on purifying properties to the Megamycete if she worships the Megamycete/Megamycete as a black god? And I don't really understand what purifying properties to the Megamycete have to do with her experiments if she was trying to make sure the vessel for Ava had Megamycete abilities. In Resident Evil 4, for instance, Osmond Sadler tasked Louis Serra with finding a way to remove the plague of parasites from the hosts, but not for the reason you think. He did this to make sure that the methods for removing the parasite would be too specific, which would allow his plans to destroy the United States to not be hindered, which was ultimately the case, as only a special kind of radiation could destroy the plaga within the hosts once they hatched. This makes a lot of sense, but Miranda's research on purifying properties to the Megamycete didn't make sense to me at the time of my blind playthrough. I can't help but feel like this was intentional to make the player suspicious of Miranda's ulterior motives and the wild goose chase we've been going through, but honestly, I just feel it makes the non-diegetic nature to this MacGuffin purifying crystal that much more conspicuous, not giving it that much of a leg to stand on in terms of an idea. Speaking of which, Miranda manifests in front of Rose after she uses the purifying crystal. Waiting a long time for Rose, Miranda addresses herself by name, which Rose recognizes as the name of the individual who killed her dad. Miranda says that Rose had become so powerful that she couldn't subdue her directly, which I assume is in reference to what happened in the main game, where a 6-month-old Rose somehow stripped Miranda of some of her abilities. They don't even make it clear if Eveline had a presence there, and if that was how Rose stripped Miranda of her ability 16 years ago. That's what I was thinking at the time, assuming that the quote, "Rose is Eveline's true complete form," had some relevance to Eveline's presence, but it didn't seem to be the case. Because Rose was so powerful, Miranda had to lure her into the realm of consciousness to make her willingly relinquish her abilities. Her method for luring her was this.
No, but Kay said...
Did he? Or did I?
What?
That
What?
was an illusion.
What? I was left gobsmacked by how ludicrous this sounded. This is the worst plot hole in the DLC by far. How the hell did Miranda manipulate Rose from within the realm of consciousness? How long had she been doing this? How did she sample Canine's DNA to create this convincing hallucination of him? How did no one see Rose talking to no one? There is no possible way she used a mechanism similar to Quorem sensing to link to the Megamycete present within Rose when the Megamycete was very far from her. How did she access this kind of ability when she never demonstrated this in the main game? Even if all this time in the Megamycete allowed her to develop new abilities, they're only restricted to the realm of consciousness. I mean, she literally said in that file pertaining to her experiences in life that they serve only as a source of power in this realm of consciousness. How could this power branch into the real world? This is all done for cheap shock value rather than for meaningful and well-developed story content. It's the stupidest idea ever. It's not as bad as having Ethan be made out of the mold, but come on! Did they not have the common sense to come up with better screenplay that made sense? I guess that's expecting too much from an amateurish development team who acts like they've never played the main game or Resident Evil 7. Miranda says with much glee that Rose can finally become the vessel for Ava before transforming into her mutated form from the main game. All seems lost for Rose until the legendary Ethan Winters manifests between herself and Miranda. As much as I want to turn off my retrospective mindset and just let the scene progress to pay respect to Ethan, I can't do so right now. Miranda is genuinely surprised that Ethan can manifest in this stratum, so she was aware that Ethan was active in the Megamycete for 16 years. I am surprised she hasn't done anything to deal with Ethan all this time. Ethan must be really good at interfering with her and escaping combat. One has to wonder what he was doing in the Megamycete all this time. If you recall that file that talked about Eveline's interference, one has to wonder why Ethan wasn't the source of interference. That makes more sense than having Eveline be the source of interference. I could understand Ethan not wanting Miranda to clone Rose and make her the vessel for Ava, but the DLC doesn't play it off like that. And Miranda doesn't voice the question of how Ethan has a body in the realm of consciousness and is able to retain his faculties, yet he wasn't attuned to the Megamycete for life, and his full body wasn't absorbed into the Megamycete. I guess his unexplained co-opting of limbs is possibly related to strong attunement to the Megamycete, allowing him to retain his faculties in the realm of consciousness. But this seems awfully convenient and would only put him at stage 1 of his E-type Megamycete infection, which doesn't complement the idea of life attunement to the Megamycete. Ethan and Rose make their escape, eventually evading Miranda for the time being when rubble collapses behind them. Rose asks her dad why he maintained anonymity with her, to which he replies that he didn't want to complicate things and just wanted her safe. Which I do think is logical, certainly more logical than Dunderhead Chris's reasoning for why he didn't tell Ethan about Miranda masquerading as Mia in the main game. Making their way outside, Miranda nearly captures Rose, but Ethan gets between them again. Telling Rose that he's got this, he then tells her to escape, but Rose doesn't want to leave him after everything she's been through and seen. Ethan understands her hesitancy, but wants to know she's safe. A furious Miranda then overpowers Ethan. Not wanting to let her dad die and remaining adamant in her beliefs, Rose finally destroys the Purifying Crystal to regain her abilities, telling her dad that she's got this. This begins the final boss fight against Miranda, but before I get to it, I do want to show my blind reaction to this entire chase.
Rose, run!
Ethan!
Ethan, you pest!
Go!
She said his name!
Even he can manifest.
She said his name! She said his name! Again! He has weapons! Oh, Ethan looks awesome! He's so awesome! Nice! Oh, this is incredible! This is absolutely incredible! It's so awesome!
Why didn't you tell me who you really were? Why'd you let me call you Michael?
I didn't want to complicate things. I just needed you safe.
I suppose that makes sense. Because Ethan being absorbed into the Megamycete doesn't make any
And I'm
sense.
sorry I left you alone, but I had to find a way out.
All is forgiven, Ethan. All is forgiven. You beautiful man. Oh no.
Away from my love. Stay away from my family. Rose, come on.
You can't escape Rose. Ethan, persistent as always.
Rose, now's your chance. Go live a normal life. Make friends. No one will ever call you a freak again.
But
He knows?
Go!
I don't want to leave you!
I know. I love you, but I need to know that you're safe. So please, just...
Ethan, you insolent pest!
I got this. Get out of here.
No!
Don't worry, Dad. I've got this.
The final boss fight against Miranda is a fight designed by old Capcom. It is well designed, has variety, there's a lot of room to move, and it's rewarding for those that have saved up on their ammunition and White Sage. You also gain access to new abilities. Rose can now dodge, though for some reason the dodge can be obstructed by reloading, so you have to swap weapons during the reload animation if you're going to dodge quickly. She can also absorb Miranda's projectiles to replenish 2 charges. Finally, she can summon the Megamycete as a giant tendril to damage Miranda and stun her. This can also be useful to counter any of Miranda's more dangerous attacks, adding a level of skill with knowing when to use the root. The one big problem with these mechanics is that you won't be aware of their existence unless you have tooltips on. I always play with tooltips on, so I never came across this issue, but I know a lot of other people didn't know about these abilities because they played without tooltips, leading to a lot of frustration with Miranda's fight. That was definitely a blunder on new Capcom's part. Fighting Miranda normally is a lot of fun, but as I've stated in an earlier part of this retrospective, if you've amassed on a lot of White Sage, you can stunlock Miranda and prevent her from attacking for the full fight. Miranda always tries to transition into the flying phase before attacking you. If you use the Megamycete tendril, the moment she recovers from the phase transition animation, you can stun her and unload on her with your weapons. Because Miranda is programmed to stumble away from you when she recovers from the stun, it is important to position yourself during the stun in such a way that she will stumble back into the arena, rather than out of the arena, so that you can remain close to her and use the Megamycete tendril against her. Repeating this process a couple of times will allow you to end the fight. To talk about the non-gameplay aspects of Miranda's fight, I like the idea of Rose finally using her abilities to better effect against Miranda. I don't find the tone of the fight to be as good as Miranda's fight in the main game, since there are those moments where Rose spouts out cheesy one-liners and other moments that impact the tone a bit, especially after Ethan was critically impaled. Speaking of Ethan, it's interesting how Miranda subtly praises Ethan on how persistent he is when she acknowledges to Rose that she is truly Ethan's daughter. And talking about quotes, Miranda says during her fight that she cultivated the realm of consciousness in order to resurrect her daughter. I'm a little confused by this because it makes it seem like the realm of consciousness didn't exist before Miranda. I mean, at the start of Rose's section, she's inside that lab while in the realm of consciousness, which gives the impression that each individual inside of the Megamycete contributes to the realm of consciousness subconsciously. There is no way Miranda added that lab to the realm of consciousness, because how would she be able to do that if she's never seen it before? I get that the consciousnesses and memories of individuals were all diluted and diffused, but I feel like that would translate into the areas being connected weirdly, the jumbling of environments, and other similar things. And how does the realm of consciousness itself contribute to Ava's resurrection? If she's talking about the creation of her lab, the organic cloning device, and the environments where the stress test took place, then I guess that makes a bit of sense. She then says that no matter how many vessels she created, none of them had the power to regenerate Ava, which is why the real Rose is the only one who can bring her back. Now, this opens up an interesting possibility that I didn't consider in the earlier parts of this retrospective. Is it possible that Miranda was building up the capabilities of the vessels to eventually allow them to use Mimicry to change their bodies? I never did consider Mimicry as a potential ability for these vessels. I thought Miranda was the only one capable of this, and that it would only work using the genetic data sampled by the Megamycete, but maybe that's something to consider. And maybe the whole reason for the Purifying Crystal was to temporarily disrupt Rose's abilities, so that once Rose was implanted with Ava's memories and consciousness, Miranda would then remove the Purifying Crystal's influence, allowing Ava to use her newfound capabilities to perform Mimicry and change her body into the correct form. I assume that's what the developers were going for, but this still doesn't excuse the other confusing plot elements, how all of this is taking place in the realm of consciousness, and how Ava's dissolute memories couldn't possibly be restored by a vessel that has the ability to use Mimicry. So how would a vessel or abilities even matter in a realm where the rules of reality don't apply? And also, we're talking about the consciousness of a 10-year-old, for crying out loud. How would a 10-year-old possibly have the ability to learn how to perform Mimicry? It doesn't make sense. Miranda delivers one final barrage to subdue Rose. She nearly succeeds, but Ethan is able to transfer his own abilities into Rose, empowering her. With all of her strength, Rose unleashes her final attack and grounds Miranda. Standing headstrong and with much conviction, accepting of who she is, Rose tells Miranda that she is not some vessel or stupid copy. She is Rose, before disrupting Miranda's autoinducers to trigger a lethal biocrystallization reaction within her that ultimately destroys her consciousness, wiping her from existence. What follows afterwards is meant to be an emotional farewell between father and daughter, but I need to turn on my retrospective mindset for this scene because I do have problems with it. For one thing, when Ethan calls out to Rose and says, "Hey sweetie," I feel like there are problems with the delivery of this line. Todd solely doesn't make it sound like it fits the context of his character dying, and I feel like he could have said Rose rather than "Hey sweetie." Everything else with the conversation is good, and I still care about Ethan at this moment, but I don't like the camera work in certain shots when you get those glimpses of Ethan's face. The perspective is awkward and limiting, and the field of view is incongruous and not so pleasing to the viewer's eyes when watching it. It's so disorienting seeing the camera block out Ethan's eyes and face. They're really trying to go to great lengths to hide Ethan's face through awkward camera work. It's like the developers are taking their satisfaction with hiding Ethan's face and perverting it into something that's meant to be memed or ridiculed. That is disrespectful to the original vision that Resident Evil 7's developers had with Ethan, and it feels satirical with how they're making fun of themselves. They should have shown his face at this moment like any normal developer would. I mean, it's the last time we'll ever see Ethan, and it's supposed to be an emotional send-off between father and daughter, and it's ruined by these childish attempts by the developers to mock the original vision of Ethan Winters that the Resident Evil 7 developers had, whether it be through the poor camera work cutting off half of his face, or with how Ethan's arm obstructs his face. It definitely came back around to bite them in the end, and it ruins the emotional farewell the scene was trying to convey. And it's not just here. There are other moments in the prior cutscenes where the same issue was apparent, but I don't feel like they were as bad because those shots didn't last too long, and the camera work had to focus a bit more on Rose and not so much on Ethan in certain shots. I don't understand what they were thinking here, and it's a far cry away from how wonderful the camera work was during Ethan's sacrifice in the main game. The camera work was masterfully done as it worked to subtly convey how Ethan felt ready to pass on after fighting for so long to protect Rose. I mean, the moment where he collapses to the ground, or when he separates himself from Chris and Rose while holding the N2 explosive, saddened me greatly. And it couldn't have worked without the masterful camera work. There was no moment where the perspective was limiting or disorienting. You didn't need to see glimpses of Ethan's face to feel his emotions or understand that he's reached his end. It all spoke for itself in that context. But with the cutscenes involving him in the DLC, the context of what's happening is entirely different, and the developer's inability to create proper camera work really shows itself here. I genuinely don't understand how when deciding to settle upon the third-person perspective and bringing in Ethan Winters, they didn't consider the proper context or potential problems that may result from this decision. And like I said before, it feels amateurish, and it feels like they were intentionally mocking Resident Evil 7's developers with what they said about tying the first-person perspective to Ethan. I don't remember the specific video where they talked about the connection between the first-person perspective and Ethan, but you can be sure that I understood the value that Resident Evil 7's developers saw with that connection. The developers of this DLC clearly didn't, and with such a one-dimensional thought process on par with any regular fan not able to grasp nuance, they saw that connection as a joke to be mocked or memed. It is a massive disservice. But moving past this, it then fades to white. We are given no indication of what happened to Ethan, and Rose is back in the real world somehow. Assuming the Executioner DLC from The Evil Within is a good form of reference, by removing the controlling powers at play and being the only living being inside of the realm of consciousness, Rose was able to regain consciousness and leave the Megamycete, implying that Ethan's consciousness was dead. Is that really how they're going to end Ethan Winters? Or is what I'm saying not true, and Ethan's consciousness is still alive, but his fate is left uncertain? Regardless of what route you take, Ethan is given a poor ending to his character, even if he did save Rose and was left assured that she was safe. Moving on, the screenplay here is odd, as when she awakens, she's not next to the Megamycete, she's in a chair that's distant from the Megamycete. When Rose connected to the Megamycete at the start of the DLC, she was standing. How could she be sitting in a chair distant to the Megamycete? It doesn't make sense. What makes even less sense is how out of nowhere, Ethan's wedding ring is magically in Rose's right hand. You can see in many of these shots that Rose was not holding his ring in her right hand and was even curling her hand and maintaining postures in such a way that there was no way she was holding anything in her hand. She never had it in the beginning of the DLC. What am I supposed to take away from this? That it transferred from the realm of consciousness to here? How does that make any sense? I highly doubt it's some kind of neuro residue from transferring from the realm of consciousness to here, because the ring would only appear temporarily if that were the case. But she still has it later on. And why Ethan's ring? Why would this be relevant to Rose, assuming that we're now supposed to think of it as some kind of residue? I get that when she looks at it, she immediately thinks of Ethan, but that's the last thing I would have thought of. She's already wearing his jacket, for crying out loud! You ask me, the developers forgot to include the wedding ring in the beginning cutscene since these developers didn't have much common sense when designing this DLC. It then fades to black and we're put into the same epilogue scene from the main game. This left me shocked, but in the wrong sort of way. The whole time throughout my blind playthrough, I thought this DLC took place after the epilogue. I was so wrong after seeing this. This is another blunder on the developer's part. By setting this DLC before the epilogue, it recontextualizes the epilogue entirely, forcing you to perceive the epilogue from the confused mentalities and improper lore points prevalent throughout the DLC. Rose was fine where she left off in the main game, since we could imply what likely occurred in the 16-year period between the main game and the epilogue that could cause Rose to express a lot of love for her dad, and now she knows about Eveline too, without believing that ridiculous scenarios took place in that interim. This choice in the screenplay just contextualizes the DLC as being a case of Occam's razor to get to an outcome that would have been easily achieved by the simplest path. The simplest path is what's left to interpretation that falls within the realm of common sense and logical events, which is of course that Rose likely read files that Ethan made at his house, read files from Chris and the Hound Wolf Squad, read files or saw video footage of what happened with Ethan and Eveline, and also read files or saw video footage of Miranda from the Hound Wolf Squad. The Shadows of Rose DLC is the convoluted path. Both of these paths get to the same outcome of Rose going to the cemetery. The only difference is the consequence of how they recontextualize the outcome. And this makes me hate the Shadows of Rose DLC for doing this. All of the problems I listed with the Shadows of Rose DLC have increased in magnitude thanks to how they poorly recontextualized the events of the epilogue and what the characters say during the epilogue. I can better elaborate on these points by going through the epilogue. Rose is on a bus and has the Village of Shadows book that Miranda read to her at the start of the main game. We never saw this book in the DLC, so why would she have it now? If she couldn't remember the toy monkey she considered a friend when she was a baby, how could she remember this book? She also takes the time to inspect Ethan's ring, which she's now wearing on her pointer finger. I'm surprised I didn't catch on to this sooner, that she's wearing the ring on her left pointer finger. Is there a significance to this? I've read somewhere that this could relate to familial ties, but this was back in the past where people wore family crests or signets. I've also seen that wearing a ring on your pointer finger relates to leadership, confidence, and self-esteem, so maybe she's wearing it instead of keeping it in her pocket to attribute her increased self-esteem and confidence to him, and also to keep him close to her. She also sees a mother and daughter reading a book together, which likely made her think of Mia. Arriving at Ethan's grave on his birthday, Rose apologizes for missing last week, since she had a lot of tests coming up that he should know what it's like. I don't think she's talking about school tests. I think she's talking about tests that Chris and whatever organization he's working for have put her through to test her abilities, since she later says, "Talk of the goddamn devil." With an organization's vehicle parked beside her, she tells her dad goodbye and that she loves him. Rose then approaches the agent, who had been searching for her. The first time I saw this agent in the main game, I thought he was a member of the DSO, which is Leon's organization, since this cutscene oddly mirrors the same cutscene from Resident Evil 6, where Helena is at her sister's grave before Leon, Hunnigan, and another agent arrive to put her into the service of the DSO, since she was acquitted of her supposed crimes against President Benford. I'd like to think the DSO wasn't disbanded if the BSAA was evil and supposedly disbanded, and maybe Chris is working for the DSO now. The agent tells Rose that there is a situation, before facetiously calling Rose Eveline for some reason. What an asshole. What is wrong with this guy for tempting fate like this? It's like he's trying to get Rose to act out of anger to justify a forceful incapacitation of her, like a corrupt cop. And there are too many of those kinds of cops in our world as it is. And I don't understand the context for his offensive humor. Why does he call Rose Eveline when they have no similarities with each other? It's like they designed this line with the Rose is Eveline's true complete form in mind, because they thought that line meant Rose is Eveline like I thought initially, but the DLC treats Rose and Eveline like two separate individuals, so it recontextualizes this offensive humor into something confusing. To be fair though, the main game doesn't make sense as well with how it contextualizes this offensive humor. This is all so confusing, so why this agent's offensive humor was written into this and considered properly placed by QA is confusing. And during my blind playthrough, hearing this agent's offensive humor made me remember that Eveline was completely forgotten about after we dealt with her in her area, so this again recontextualizes this offensive humor into something confusing, as why would he just mention her out of the blue when we practically forgot about her in the finale of the DLC? I don't understand. Rose angrily demands that the agent never call her that again before he tries to defend his actions with the obligatory "it's just a joke" counter. I totally relate to Rose at this moment, as I've dealt with too many assholes who have justified their bullying as jokes, and I've even seen other people defend their actions and call me the one acting out of line. The world is such a screwed up place, let me tell you. Rose threatens the agent by telling him that she can do things that even Chris doesn't know she can do, which, as I talked about in an earlier part, doesn't really make sense, as there isn't any Megamycete around for her to manipulate. Either that, or she probably has similar abilities to Miranda and the other lords that only require manipulating the Megamycete already within her, not needing to generate Megamycete in excess. It's all left to interpretation, but knowing new Capcom, they're not going to follow up on this. Capcom in general has this habit of leaving plot points unresolved in certain Resident Evil games. The most clear example of this is Natalia from Resident Evil Revelations 2, since at the end of the game, Alex Wesker's consciousness is clearly growing within her, yet we haven't seen her for over 10 years within the Resident Evil continuity. I guess she'll only be significant once she's reached her young adult or adult age. And isn't it funny how Revelations 2 is another game that involves the use of a vessel to revive a consciousness? One has to wonder if the developers of Revelations 2 had input with the story of Resident Evil Village. No wonder the same level of unresolved plot points is prevalent throughout this DLC. Rose brushes the agent aside and heads into the car. The agent is told by a sniper that they have a clear shot, but he can handle it, and Rose is just a kid. Oh, now you want to act all professional all of a sudden. And they really sent a sniper alongside the agent? Why now? Rose didn't have a sniper watching her previously. Why now are they designating her as a potential threat to have eyes on? And with the DLC recontextualizing events, are we to assume that Rose was being watched the entire time? If this was the case, why did no one notice that Rose was talking to nobody at the park and was acting strange? This probably wasn't the case, but I feel it's a valid question. Like I said, setting the DLC before the epilogue muddies the story even more. And they don't even add more to the epilogue as a form of payoff for playing the DLC. They just give you the same epilogue from the main game because that's somehow a worthy payoff to your investment in the DLC. Inside the car, the agent tells Rose that she's a lot like Ethan, which Rose already knows. How would the agent know about Ethan? He says this line like he's actually seen Ethan in person. Did he see Ethan in quarantine? It doesn't seem like it given his status as an agent. And the part where Rose says that she knows, what do you bet that was what gave the developers incentive to do this DLC? I feel like that's the line that would be most relevant to the recontextualization provided by this DLC, as by saying she knows in the manner that she did, it comes across like she actually met Ethan in person, which she did in the DLC, and that's what allowed her to maintain a huge emotional connection to him. That has to be the line that the developers paid more attention to when coming up with the DLC. The idea of that recontextualization sounds interesting, but the fact that it has to violate lore is problematic. I still think that Rose could maintain that emotional connection to her dad through files and video footage of him. I mean, she already had that level of connection to him when she said that in times of anxiety and feeling down, she would try to imagine what he would have said had he been alive. Also, she was likely told by Chris, Mia, and other organization members what her dad was like. Her imprinting of what an ideal dad is to her served as a coping mechanism in order to deal with her traumas and bullying through her tender years and now. And I think that not seeing her mom in ages and accepting her absence had contributed to that deep emotional connection to her dad. All of these factors show why the recontextualization that the DLC provides was not needed in the first place. This part of the Rose's arc was already in a satisfactory spot before the DLC was released. That is my stance on the matter. Rose and the agent drive away, and at some point, a mysterious figure appears in the background beyond the car. In my blind playthrough of the main game, I didn't even pay attention to this mysterious figure, nor realize he was there. For a time, no one knew who this mysterious figure was until modders found out it was Ethan. This led into a huge speculation that Ethan was actually alive, which doesn't make any sense. In the context of the main game, there was no way that Ethan was alive, given that he reached his hayflick limit and started crystallizing. He even told Chris that he and Miranda finished each other off, so he knew that he was on his last legs. The Duke even told Ethan that his body was falling apart before he went to fight Miranda. There was already clear evidence that Ethan was dead, as it fell in line with the lore established in the End of Zoe DLC. And before modders even found out it was Ethan in the distance, were there people that really believed that was Ethan? I don't think so. You can't say that the developers intentionally tried to convey that Ethan was alive if he's barely recognizable to the viewer, and you can only see him if you mod the game. They clearly didn't want there to be speculation that Ethan was alive and that he was returning for another sequel. And talking about the DLC and how it recontextualizes the scene, people tried to say that he was now an apparition that Rose could see. If Ethan's ring somehow manifested in Rose's hand when she returned from the realm of consciousness, then she probably willed Ethan's apparition into existence as part of her abilities. The developers made it this way to give Ethan a happy ending. That's what their reasoning was. That sounds ludicrous, honestly. How can anyone think that being a mysterious figure in the distance is somehow a happy ending? Would you like it if your favorite character was in the distance, unable to be recognized? And again, were those other people seriously thinking that the mysterious figure was Ethan before PC mods and bugs in photo mode allowed people to see who that mysterious figure was? I've never heard of anything so ridiculous in all my life. I mean, I love Ethan Winters, but the fact that he has to be trapped in a domain of confusing and convenient plot points to supposedly be alive or be in some kind of apparition form is so bad. It's literally the same problem that Mia went through in the main game of Resident Evil Village, and I pointed this out in my Resident Evil Village retrospective. It's honestly reminiscent of what Ubisoft did with Cassandra in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where they brought her into the modern day wearing a suit and living for 2,500 years. I cannot properly put into words how stupid that entire scene was with its presentation, and how it recontextualizes certain events in the Assassin's Creed series. And returning to Resident Evil, I cannot imagine Ethan being in the kind of state that fans think he might be in. And you can't even say that Ethan's returning for a sequel, because the developer said many times that this would be his last game. When you beat the main story, it literally says that the father's story is done. So even if Ethan's amassed a greater following, the developers have no reason to bring him back. It's all a mess in the end, and this all comes full circle into why this DLC is a poor ending to the Winters family story arc. Rose is a semi-decent character who starts off very poorly, saying really dumb stuff that shows that she was raised by Dunderhead Chris, before slightly redeeming herself by the end of the DLC. We have no appearance of Mia, who is supposed to be a crucial aspect to Ethan's character, and this is likely due to the developers not being able to get Katie O'Hagan back for the role. And we have Ethan, who for some reason people think is alive in the end, but is rendered just a mysterious figure in the distance, who has no chance of returning, a fate hardly tolerable to people who truly love him as a character. They screwed the Winters family hard with this DLC. How insulting and offensive. They rushed this DLC to a fiery end because too many other fans wanted them out of the way. And I get that the developers started this DLC directly after Resident Evil Village was finished, so they only had less than a year to develop this DLC. But as I've stated before, I have played incredible games that were only developed for 10 months, for instance. There is no excuse for this incompetence on the developer's part with the quality of this DLC. This DLC is literally Occam's razor in its presentation and placement in the timeline. The gameplay is incredibly mundane in so many parts. The story is so badly handled, you'd think the developers never played a Resident Evil game before, or never had common sense when developing it. The lost potential of the DLC is so blatantly noticeable. The writing is filled with so much confusion. The lore is a complete disaster. The characters treat what happens in the realm of consciousness like it's reality, and there are so many more issues with this DLC. I genuinely do not understand the developer's vision with this entire DLC, and that confusion, like I already said before, bled into so many parts of the DLC. As a true Resident Evil player, I expected better. And that's that, guys. I did not expect to write at least 71 pages for a DLC that can be beaten in less than an hour. I guess it goes to show how much of a mess this story DLC was, or just how much I was invested with its issues, because they were in a Winters family game. The Winters family were given a much better ending to their arc in the main game than what happened in the DLC. There's a part of me that hopes that Rose will be in a future game, and that Ethan is somehow alive, but as I stated before, it is unlikely that new Capcom will proceed with that. With all that said, this concludes my first retrospective of a DLC. My next project will be the retrospective/review of Resident Evil 4 Remake, that pre-alpha that represents the worst Resident Evil game ever made, the worst remake of a game I have ever played, and the worst game I have ever played in my entire life as a gamer. I can only imagine how long that retrospective will be. It might be longer than the Grand Canyon, for all I know, but that remains to be seen. With all that said, thank you very much for watching this retrospective. I wish you all the best, and you guys take care now.